The aircraft carrier was already burning. Not the kind of fire that kills a ship. Not yet. A single compartment, port side, midships, where a 330-pound warhead had just punched a hole the size of a garage door through the hull plating of the USS Vela Gulf. But we are getting ahead of ourselves by about 9 minutes. Rewind. The Strait of Hormuz is not a waterway. It is a political statement disguised as geography. 21 nautical miles wide at its narrowest, squeezed further by international shipping lanes into a corridor roughly 6 miles across. It is the passage through which 17 million barrels of oil move every single day. 1/5 of the world's petroleum supply slides through this crack in the coastline between Iran and Oman, and every barrel of it passes within visual range of Iranian military installations that have been staring at this water since 1979. Into this corridor, on a morning when the sea state was 2 feet and the wind was negligible, the United States Navy pushed 100,000 tons of sovereign territory. The USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, CVN-69, a Nimitz-class nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, 1,092 feet from bow to stern, drawing almost 40 feet of water, moving at 5 knots through the most watched stretch of ocean on the planet. 5 knots. A brisk walking pace. A speed that makes sense when you are managing the thermal signatures of 2 A4W nuclear reactors and coordinating with a formation of escorts spread across several miles of sea, but a speed that also means anything faster than a rowing boat can run you down. The Eisenhower was not alone. She never is. 3 miles to the north, the guided missile cruiser USS Vela Gulf, CG-72, a Ticonderoga-class ship carrying the Aegis combat system and 96 vertical launch cells loaded with a cocktail of SM-2 surface-to-air missiles and Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles. 3 miles to the southeast, the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer USS Gravely, DDG-107, carrying the same Aegis system, the same launch cells, and 2 Phalanx close-in weapon systems that could spit 20mm tungsten rounds at 4,500 rounds per minute. Together the 3 ships represented roughly $4.6 billion of American military engineering. The flight deck alone, 4.5 acres of non-skid coated steel, held 44 F divided by a -18E and F Super Hornets, 5 EA, 18G Growler electronic warfare jets, and enough ordnance in the magazines below to flatten a mid-sized city. 2 nuclear reactors hummed beneath the waterline, reactors that would not need refueling for 20 years. 5,000 sailors ate breakfast, stood watch, maintained aircraft, and went about the mundane business of operating a floating airfield in hostile waters. And 72 hours before any of this, before the carrier had even entered the Gulf, the transit plan had been filed with 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain, 350 nautical miles to the southwest. Every detail coordinated. Every contingency briefed. A carrier transit through Hormuz is a choreographed event, rehearsed and refined over decades of repetition. The Navy has been driving carriers through this strait since the 1980s. They have it down to a science. The problem with science is that the other side studies it too. 11 nautical miles northeast of the Eisenhower's projected track, in a sun-bleached fishing port called Bandar-e Jask, the morning began differently. Jask sits at the eastern mouth of the strait, a cluster of concrete piers that normally hosts 30 to 40 small dhows and fishing skiffs. At 6:20 local time, 27 minutes before the Eisenhower would enter the narrowest section of the channel, the first boats started leaving. They left in pairs. Quiet departures, separated by 30 to 60 seconds, slipping out of the harbor mouth and turning southwest. Peiken-class fast inshore attack craft, 46 feet long, powered by twin diesel waterjet engines capable of 52 knots. Ashura-class boats, smaller, lighter, faster in a straight line. And mixed among them, civilian rigid hull inflatables that had been modified in ways that would not be obvious until you were close enough to see the welded weapons mounts on their bows. The Peiken carries a crew of 3 and either 2 Nor anti-ship cruise missiles or a single 324mm torpedo tube. The Nor is a derivative of the Chinese C-802, a sea-skimming anti-ship missile with a range of 22 miles and a 330-pound warhead that arrives at its target traveling 680 miles per hour, roughly Mach 0.98, at an altitude of 15 feet above the wave tops. Each Peiken costs approximately $500,000. Each Nor missile, roughly $200,000. Numbers that would not buy a single engine on one of the Super Hornets parked on the Eisenhower's flight deck. The Ashura-class boats carried no missiles at all. Some had DSHK 12.7mm heavy machine guns. Some had rocket-propelled grenades. 3 of them carried nothing but outboard engines and speed. Their purpose was not to kill anything. Their purpose was to be there, to fill the radar screen with contacts. To make every targeting decision aboard every American ship take 4 or 5 seconds longer than it should. In a fight measured in minutes, those seconds are the weapon. 16 miles to the west of Jask, a second cluster of boats launched from a concealed inlet near Kustak, then a third group from further west. The swarm was assembling itself across a front of almost 30 miles, converging on the shipping lanes from multiple bearings, and it was doing so in vessels that cost roughly $25,000 apiece. The entire Iranian attack fleet approaching that morning, all 60 boats, totaled approximately $1.5 million. About what it costs to fly a single training sortie for a single Super Hornet. Here is what the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy understood about American carrier operations, and it is worth pausing on this because the entire engagement turns on it. The IRGCN does not train to sink aircraft carriers. No one in Tehran believes 60 fiberglass speedboats are going to put a 100,000-ton nuclear warship on the bottom of the Strait of Hormuz. That is not the plan. That has never been the plan. The plan is to create a decision crisis. A carrier strike group operating in confined waters under rules of engagement that require positive identification before weapons release is a system that runs on information. The CIC, the Combat Information Center aboard the Eisenhower, processes hundreds of contacts simultaneously, classifying each one, assigning threat levels, tracking bearing, speed, and course. It is extraordinarily good at this. But it is good at this against the threats it was designed to face. Cruise missiles flying at known profiles. Aircraft squawking identifiable transponder codes. Submarines moving at predictable speeds through predictable water. 60 fiberglass boats with radar cross-sections smaller than a pelican, moving at 60 miles per hour through waters already crowded with 200 to 400 civilian contacts, are not the threat the system was optimized for. The boats do not need to penetrate the defense. They need to overwhelm the decision cycle. And every sailor in that CIC knows, with a precision that borders on genetic memory, what happened the last time an American warship in this strait made a targeting decision too fast. Iran Air Flight 655, July 1988. The cruiser USS Vincennes misidentified an Airbus A300 civilian airliner climbing on a known commercial flight path and fired two SM-2 missiles. 290 people died. That incident is not a footnote in the rules of engagement. It is the rules of engagement. Every classification, every identification, every decision to shoot or not shoot runs through the filter of that memory. The IRGCN commander orchestrating this operation from a hardened bunker 8 miles inland from Bandar Abbas understood this. He had designed his attack not around the physics of warheads and hull plating, but around the psychology of a 5,000-person crew trained to be terrified of making a mistake. At 0651 local time, the Eisenhower CIC logged 14 new surface contacts emerging from the eastern shoreline. 4 minutes later, the count was 23. By 0658, it was 41. Every one of them headed southwest into the shipping lanes at speeds between 35 and 52 knots. The watch officer had a classification problem that was getting worse by the second. But here is where the story bends in a direction the IRGCN commander did not anticipate. 45 minutes before his first boats had cleared the harbor at Jask, a U.S. Navy P-8A Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft had been flying a racetrack pattern at 28,000 feet, 140 nautical miles to the southwest. The Poseidon carries the ANS/APS-154 Advanced Airborne Sensor, a synthetic aperture radar capable of imaging surface contacts at ranges exceeding 200 nautical miles with resolution fine enough to count the outboard engines on a fishing boat. At 0601 local time, the Poseidon crew had transmitted a complete surface picture of every harbor along the Iranian coast to 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain. Every boat catalogued, every pier photographed. The baseline was set. When the boats began moving at 6:20, the departure was tracked in near real time by a second asset already on station. An MQ-4C Triton, the Navy's high-altitude unmanned surveillance aircraft, wingspan 131 feet, cruising at 56,000 feet, 190 nautical miles to the south. The Tritons and ZPY-3 multifunction active sensor had been painting the Iranian coastline continuously for 11 hours. It had watched the boats being loaded. It had watched the crews arrive. Every single vessel in that swarm had a track number assigned to it before its crew had finished their morning prayers. The decision crisis the IRGCN designed required confusion. What it got was confirmation. Back in the CIC, the picture was dense but it was not dark. The pre-transit intelligence package had identified 14 Peiken-class fast attack craft, 22 Ashura-class boats, and 24 unclassified small craft in the approaching formation. The watch officer had the Poseidon's data. He had the Triton's tracks. He knew which boats had come from military harbors and which had come from fishing piers. The classification problem that was supposed to take 5 agonizing minutes took about 90 seconds. He reported up the chain. He requested the alert helicopter, an MH-60R Seahawk armed with AGM-114 Hellfire missiles at $117,000 each and an airborne radar that could classify surface contacts at 40 nautical miles. He requested the gravely close to intercept distance. He did everything by the book. The difference was that the book had already been read. At 0703, the Seahawk lifted off the Eisenhower's flight deck, 90 seconds to 500 feet. The sensor operator began working contacts from west to east using the ANS/APS-153 multimode radar and the MX-15 electro-optical turret. 8 seconds per classification. 41 contacts at last count meant roughly 5.5 minutes for a full sweep. But the crew was not starting from zero. They were confirming what the Triton had already reported. The classifications came faster. Weapons mounts on the lead boats. Missile rails on the Pacons. Machine guns on the Assuras. By the time the Seahawk had been airborne for 3 minutes, 11 boats had been positively confirmed as hostile. Under the standing rules of engagement, a vessel carrying visible weapons, moving at attack speed, on a direct heading toward a U.S. warship, constitutes demonstrated hostile intent. No missile launch required. No shots fired. The geometry and the weapons are enough. 5 miles to the north, the Vela Gulf's captain made a call. He ordered his ship to 25 knots on an intercept heading northeast, putting 10,000 tons of guided missile cruiser between the approaching swarm and the Eisenhower's beam. The Vela Gulf carried the Spy-1B phased array radar, 4 fixed panels each scanning a 90-degree quadrant, the most sophisticated radar system afloat. It was designed to track ballistic missile warheads falling from space at Mach 15. Using it to sort speedboats from fishing dhows at 6 miles was like using a surgical laser to cut birthday cake. Functional, but not the intended application. At 0706, the count reached 53. 7 more boats had appeared from the direction of Kustak. The swarm was arranged in a rough crescent, its leading edge 6 nautical miles from the Eisenhower, its trailing elements still 12 miles out. The crescent shape was deliberate. It forced the American escorts to choose which arc to cover. Defend the north, expose the south, cover the east, leave the northwest open. There is no geometry that allows 3 ships to cover 60 converging boats across a 120-degree arc. At 0708, the Eisenhower's captain ordered the carrier to 12 knots and began a turn to starboard, angling the bow toward the wider water to the south. A Nimitz-class carrier at 12 knots needs 3,200 yards to complete a 90-degree turn. The shipping lane was 6 miles wide. The turn would eat a third of the available maneuvering room, but staying in the narrows was worse. At 0710, the Gravely fired the first shots of the engagement. Not a missile. Not the 5-inch gun. The forward Mark 38 Mod 2 chain gun, a 25mm stabilized weapon that can put rounds on target at 2,200 yards. The 3 lead boats from the eastern arc were inside that range and closing fast, weapons visible, heading unchanged. The tactical action officer aboard the Gravely had her authority. She used it. The first burst was 20 rounds across 4 seconds. Each round cost roughly $35. The burst caught the lead Paycan at an angle that tore the bow off and flipped the wreckage sideways into the boat running beside it. 2 boats removed from the fight for $700 in ammunition. A ship worth $2.2 billion had just defended itself with a cost equivalent of dinner for 2 at a mid-range restaurant. The swarm reacted because it had been trained to react. The remaining boats split. 18 broke south at 52 knots, arcing around toward the Eisenhower stern. 12 continued east toward the Gravely, opening their spacing to 300-yard intervals to complicate the targeting solution. 28 held their crescent formation from the north, compressing toward the Vela Gulf. 3 miles north, the Vela Gulf opened fire with her forward 5-inch Mark 45 gun. Not at the boats. Into the water, 500 yards ahead of the northern group. Warning shots. A 5-inch naval round weighs 70 pounds and travels at 2,690 feet per second. Each one costs $2,000. The geysers erupted in a line that any boat driver on Earth could interpret. The northern group did not stop. 6 boats peeled off east. 22 accelerated. At 0712, the first Nor missile launched from a Paycan in the eastern group, 4.1 nautical miles from the Gravely. The missile dropped off its rail, the solid rocket booster ignited, and it accelerated to Mach 0.98, descending to 15 feet above the wave tops. Time to impact at that range, approximately 22 seconds. The Gravely Spy-1D radar had the missile before the booster finished burning. The Phalanx CIWS, a white dome the size of a commercial dumpster bolted to the ship's superstructure, swiveled and locked. The system is fully automatic in its terminal engagement mode. At 1,500 yards, it fired. The 20mm tungsten penetrator rounds formed a wall of metal in the missile's flight path. The Nor flew into that wall at 680 miles per hour and ceased to exist 800 yards from the Gravely's hull. 6 seconds from detection to kill. $2,400 in ammunition against a $200,000 missile. But the Phalanx has a number that haunts every surface warfare officer who has ever stood watch. 1,550 rounds in the magazine. At 4,500 rounds per minute, that is roughly 20 seconds of trigger time. One engagement might use 300 rounds. The Gravely had 2 Phalanx mounts. If 5 missiles arrived simultaneously from different bearings, the arithmetic collapsed. The IRGCN had studied the same arithmetic. Within 8 seconds of that first launch, 4 NOR missiles were in the air. One from the eastern group targeting the Gravely, one from the northern arc aimed at the Vela Gulf, then a second and third from separate boats in the northern formation, also aimed at the cruiser. All sea skimming, all on different bearings. IRGCN doctrine calls this a saturation salvo. The concept is older than the boats firing them. It is the oldest idea in naval warfare dressed in modern clothing. Throw more projectiles than the defense can handle. The Vela Gulf's Aegis system was built to handle exactly this kind of problem. The SBY-1B tracked all 4 missiles simultaneously and began pairing them with interceptors. But the captain made a decision that would be dissected in after-action reports for years. He did not fire SM-2 missiles at the incoming NORs. An SM-2 block IA costs $2.1 million. It is designed to kill aircraft and cruise missiles at ranges up to 90 nautical miles, maneuvering targets at altitude, the kind of threat that justifies the price tag. Spending one on a $200,000 anti-ship missile at 4 miles range, when other options existed, was a calculus he was not willing to accept. Instead he relied on the 2 Phalanx mounts and ordered the electronic warfare suite into active jamming. The SLQ-32 electronic warfare system aboard the Vela Gulf is designed to detect, classify, and jam incoming missile seekers. It pumped a wall of electromagnetic noise across the frequency bands the NOR's active radar seeker uses for terminal guidance. The NOR is fire and forget, but its seeker is a derivative of Chinese technology from the early 2000s. Against a modern electronic warfare suite, it has the electronic resilience of a television remote control. The first missile lost lock at 2,100 yards. It corkscrewed right, hit the surface, and detonated on impact with the water 400 yards off the cruiser's port beam. The blast threw a geyser 60 feet into the air. Impressive and harmless. The second missile held lock 3 seconds longer, close enough for the forward phalanx to engage. 4 seconds of fire. The missile came apart in a cloud of fragments and spray 600 yards out. The third missile had been targeted poorly from the start. It passed 1,200 yards astern without the seeker ever acquiring the ship, flew for another 9 seconds, and hit the water. The fourth missile found the Vela Gulf. It struck the port side amidships, 6 feet above the waterline, just forward of the number 2 exhaust stack. The 330-pound warhead detonated on contact. The blast tore a hole roughly 12 feet by 8 feet through the hull plating and started a fire in the auxiliary machinery room. The ship shuddered along her entire length. Damage control alarms sounded across every deck. 3 sailors were killed instantly. 11 more were wounded, 4 critically. The cruiser listed 2 degrees to port and began taking water through the breach. She did not stop fighting. Her Aegis system stayed online. Her 5-inch gun continued firing. Her engineering crew began the damage control procedures they had drilled 1,000 times. But the hit changed the nature of the engagement for every American in the formation. The carrier strike group had just taken its first combat damage in a surface action against Iranian naval forces. And every frame of what happened next would eventually be viewed by 435 members of Congress, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and roughly 200 million people with internet connections. For miles above the strait, 2F divided by a -18E Super Hornets from VFA 86, the Sidewinders, had been holding in a racetrack pattern since 0655. Launched as a precautionary combat air patrol before the swarm was fully detected, each jet carried 4 AIM-9X Sidewinder heat-seeking missiles at $472,000 each and a 20mm M61A2 Vulcan cannon with 578 rounds. The AIM-9X was designed to kill fighter aircraft pulling 9 GS at Mach 2. The idea of firing one at a wooden boat doing 60 miles per hour belongs in a different category of military procurement. But the Vulcan cannon, a weapon that has been in service in various forms since 1959, works exactly as well against a speedboat as it does against anything else that cannot survive being hit with 200 rounds of 20mm high explosive incendiary in 2 seconds. At 0714, both Super Hornets rolled in on the southern arc, the 18 boats that had broken off to circle behind the Eisenhower stern. The lead aircraft descended to 1,200 feet and opened up. A 2-second burst, 200 rounds, $14,000 in ammunition. The burst walked across 3 boats in a line. The first disintegrated. The second caught fire and began circling with no one alive at the helm. The third took hits to both outboard engines and went dead in the water, drifting. The second jet hit the southern arc from the opposite bearing 4 seconds later. Same profile, same result. 2 more boats destroyed, 1 disabled. In 11 seconds of combined gun time, the southern threat no longer existed. $28,000 of 20mm rounds against $125,000 of boats. The pilots pulled up, re-entered their holding pattern, and waited for instructions. The northern arc was a different problem. 22 boats were now within 3 nautical miles of the Vela Gulf, which was simultaneously fighting a compartment fire, managing casualty evacuation, and trying to maintain combat systems with a hole in her side taking water. The Gravely was too far south for effective gun support. The Seahawk was out of position, having spent its time on the eastern contacts. The northern arc was closing on a wounded ship with limited close-in defense capability remaining. The Eisenhower's captain made a call that no carrier commanding officer wants to make. He launched 2 more Super Hornets. Not for air superiority. Not for a standoff strike. For close-in surface engagement inside the strait itself, below 2,000 feet, in the same airspace as helicopters, surface fire, and whatever man-portable air defense systems the Iranian boats might be carrying. The IRGCN equipped some of its crews with Missile, 2 man-portable surface-to-air missiles, Iranian copies of the Chinese QW-18, effective to roughly 14,000 feet, costing approximately $38,000 each. A $67 million Super Hornet operating at 1,200 feet and 400 knots is squarely inside that engagement envelope. The risk was real and accepted. At 0716, 3 things happened in rapid succession. The 2 new Super Hornets began their descent toward the northern group. The Gravely's embarked Seahawk fired 2 Hellfire missiles at remnants of the eastern arc, deleting 2 boats at $117,000 per kill. And in his bunker near Bandar Abbas, the IRGCN commander who had designed this operation watched his swarm lose its 14th boat in 6 minutes without accomplishing the one thing it needed to accomplish. The Eisenhower had not stopped, had not reversed course, had not called off the transit. The decision crisis he had designed had been answered. The answer was that the Americans had made their decisions before the first boat cleared the harbor. The northern group began to come apart. Not all at once. 8 boats turned east, back toward Iranian territorial waters, engines screaming at full throttle. 6 held course toward the Vela Gulf, apparently committed. The remaining 8 began doing something that the Americans had briefed but never seen in practice. They dumped their weapons overboard. Rocket launchers splashed into the strait. Machine guns went over the gunnels. In less than 30 seconds, 8 armed attack craft became 8 unarmed civilian boats, indistinguishable from the fishing dhows and recreational skiffs that populate these waters every morning. It was a pre-planned disengagement protocol, and it was elegant in its cynicism. The rules of engagement that had constrained the Americans at the start of the engagement now constrained them at the end. No weapons. No hostile action. No hostile intent. Those 8 boats were untouchable. They slowed to 10 knots and turned northeast. The Americans tracked every one of them and could do nothing. The 6 boats that held course toward the Vela Gulf fired everything they had left. 2 more Nor missiles. 1 unguided rocket salvo from an Ashura-class boat, 12 107mm rockets fanning out in a pattern designed for shore bombardment, not ship killing. Each rocket carried a 4-pound warhead against a 10,000-ton cruiser. They were gnats. But one of the 12 found the Vela Gulf's bridge wing, wounding 2 more sailors and destroying an exterior communications antenna. The 2 Nor missiles were engaged by the Gravely's Phalanx from 4 miles south. Both destroyed over open water. The CIWS had now fired 4 engagements total. Ammunition remaining, approximately 60%. Still functional. Still the cheapest effective weapon system in the fight. At 0719, the newly launched Super Hornets reached the northern group. The lead aircraft fired an AIM-9X Sidewinder at a Paykan that had just launched a missile. $472,000 of infrared-guided air-to-air missile, designed to pull 60 GS while chasing a fighter at Mach 2, dropped to sea level and intercepted a 46-foot fiberglass boat doing 52 knots. The 20-pound blast fragmentation warhead, engineered to crack titanium airframes, erased the boat from the surface of the strait so completely that the after-action review found no recoverable wreckage. The wingman used the cannon. 3 bursts, 3 boats, $42,000. By 0722, 15 minutes after the Gravely's first chain gun burst, the engagement was over. 23 Iranian boats sunk or disabled, 8 disarmed and retreating under the legal fiction of civilian status. The remainder scattering east toward Iranian waters at maximum speed, leaving wakes but no fight. The Vela Gulf was damaged but operational at 18 knots, listing 2 degrees to port with the fire contained to a single compartment. The Eisenhower had completed her turn to starboard and was accelerating south toward the Gulf of Oman at 22 knots, her air wings cycling overhead in stacked combat air patrols. The Gravely had not taken a scratch. The ledger for those 9 minutes reads like the receipt from an argument where everyone overpaid. Iranian material losses, approximately $8.6 million, including all missiles expended, 23 boats and their equipment on the bottom of the strait. An estimated 40 to 55 IRGCN personnel killed, a number Tehran would never confirm or discuss publicly. American ammunition expenditure across all platforms, approximately $1.9 million. Cannon rounds, Hellfire missiles, 1 Sidewinder, and several thousand rounds of Phalanx tungsten. American damage: 1 Ticonderoga-class cruiser, requiring an estimated 4 months of yard repair at a projected cost of $70 million. 5 American sailors dead. 13 wounded. A $25,000 fiberglass boat carrying a $200,000 missile had punched a $70 million hole in a billion-dollar warship. The IRGCN would frame that ratio and hang it on the wall. The U.S. Navy would note that the transit was completed on schedule and the carrier was never threatened. Both statements would be factually correct. Neither would be the full story. The Eisenhower cleared the strait at 0814 local time and entered the Gulf of Oman. Behind her, the Vela Gulf limped south at reduced speed with a Gravely riding escort and a damage control team still working below the waterline. Ahead, the open ocean and the relative safety of deep water and wide maneuvering room. In a bunker near Bandar Abbas, an IRGCN commander sat with his after-action data and a problem. He had executed the swarm doctrine exactly as designed. He had achieved a missile hit on a major American warship. And he had lost nearly half his force in under a quarter of an hour, without slowing the transit by a single minute. The decision crisis had been answered before it was posed. The prepositioned Poseidon, the Triton at 56,000 feet, the intelligence picture that eliminated the ambiguity his plan depended on. His operation required fog. The Americans had brought floodlights. 6,800 miles to the west, in a windowless briefing room in the Pentagon, a Navy captain stood before a group of congressional staffers and explained why a $4.6 billion carrier strike group had needed a $2,400 burst of 20mm chain gun rounds to survive the morning. The staffers took careful notes. They asked about the $70 million repair bill. They asked about the 5 dead sailors. They asked about the 8 boats that had dumped their weapons and driven away untouched. The captain did not mention that the $2,400 burst had worked perfectly. That was not the number anyone in that room had come to discuss. At 5:02 local time, Abraham Lincoln was 14 nautical miles from the narrowest choke point. Her escorts fanned out in a formation designed to absorb punishment from every direction at once. 2 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers rode ahead and to the flanks, their Spy 1D radar arrays painting the sky in overlapping cones. A cruiser trailed slightly aft, watching the deep water behind them. Above the formation, an E-2D Advanced Hawkeye orbited at altitude, its rotodome turning slowly, pulling signal from hundreds of miles of airspace and feeding it down into the fleet's nervous system like a second brain floating above the first. 5,000 sailors, airmen, officers, and support personnel lived inside Abraham Lincoln's hull. They ate in shifts. They slept in racks stacked 3 high. They worked in spaces where the air tasted like metal and hydraulic fluid and old sweat. Most of them would never touch a weapon. Most of them kept the ship alive so the ship could keep them alive, an exchange so deeply embedded in carrier culture that no one thought about it consciously until something forced them to. Something was about to force them to. The intelligence briefing that morning had flagged elevated activity along the Iranian coast. Not unusual for a carrier transit. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy had a long and well-documented habit of shadowing American warships through the strait, sometimes with fast boats, sometimes with drones, sometimes with nothing more than aggressive radar illumination designed to remind everyone that this water had 2 owners. The briefing used the word heightened. It did not use the word imminent. That distinction would matter in the after-action review. It would not matter at all in the next 23 minutes. At 5:09, something changed in the electronic spectrum. It did not announce itself. There was no single alarm, no bright flash on a scope. What happened was subtler and, to the men and women trained to read it, far more unsettling. Across several frequency bands monitored by the strike group's electronic warfare operators, a pattern emerged. Coastal surveillance radars that had been sweeping in routine arcs suddenly tightened their scan sectors. 2 of them stopped sweeping entirely and locked into what the operators recognized as target quality tracking. At almost the same moment, a burst of encrypted communication traffic surged from a point inland, lasted 11 seconds, and went silent. Aboard the cruiser, the senior electronic warfare officer flagged it immediately. The report climbed through the strike group's tactical net in seconds. Possible fire control activity. Multiple emitters. Coastal origin. Correlating with known ASCM sites. ASCM. Anti-ship cruise missile. 3 words that rearrange every priority on every ship in a formation the instant they appear in a sentence. The captain of Abraham Lincoln received the report on the bridge at 5:11. He was already standing. He had been standing since the steam line ruptured an hour earlier because that was the kind of officer he was. The kind who stayed vertical when his ship had a wound, even a small one. He read the report on the tactical display, asked 1 question of his operations officer, received 1 answer, and made the call. Set condition 1 throughout the ship. The bosun's pipe screamed through every compartment. Hatches that had been propped open for ventilation slammed shut and dogged down. Sailors who had been walking toward the mess for early breakfast turned around and ran. In the medical bay, corpsmen secured loose equipment and moved gurneys into position along the interior bulkheads where blast fragmentation was least likely to reach. In damage control central, teams pulled on flash gear and checked the status of every fire main, every counterflooding valve, every escape trunk. And on the flight deck, 100 feet above the waterline, the morning changed shape entirely. The deck had been configured for a standard launch cycle. 4F divided by a -18E Super Hornets were spotted near the bow catapults, 2 more aft. An EA-18G Growler sat on the port side with its wings still folded. Fuel hoses lay coiled beside aircraft. Ordnance carts were parked in the lanes between jets, loaded with precision munitions that had been scheduled for a routine training sortie over the Gulf of Oman. None of that was going to happen now. Yellow shirts began redirecting aircraft away from the catapults and into emergency hold positions. Red shirts sprinted toward the ordnance carts, not to load weapons but to secure them, because 1,000 pounds of guided steel rolling free across a flight deck during a missile impact would kill as efficiently as the missile itself. Brown shirts dropped to their knees beside tie-down chains and cranked them tight. The choreography was violent and precise and completely silent beneath the wind.
At 5:14, the Hawkeye called it. The voice was calm.
Hawkeye crews are selected partly for their ability to deliver catastrophic information as though they are reading a grocery list. What came down the net was this: multiple launch events detected, bearing 047, correlating with Bandar Abbas coastal region. Assess 4 to 6 missile-class objects. Trajectories tracking southwest. Inbound to strike group.
4 to 6. Not one. Not a warning shot. Not a probe. A salvo.
The Combat Information Center aboard Abraham Lincoln became the loudest quiet room on the planet. Every console was active. Every operator was speaking. But the volume stayed low because volume meant confusion and confusion meant death. Radar operators refined tracks. Weapons coordinators assigned threats to escorts. Communication teams pushed updates to every ship simultaneously. The Air Warfare Commander, seated at the center of the space like a conductor surrounded by instruments, began sequencing the defense.
Layer 1.
The Aegis destroyers. At 5:15, the forward destroyer locked its Spy-1D radar onto the leading inbound tracks and began generating firing solutions. The system did not hesitate. It did not ask for confirmation. Aegis was built for exactly this kind of arithmetic: multiple threats, converging bearings, collapsing time. The computer offered its answer in milliseconds. The human confirmed it in less than 2 seconds. 2 standard missiles left the forward vertical launch cells with a sound that sailors on the carrier described later as a door being ripped off its hinges by a freight train. The white exhaust columns punched upward, bent toward the horizon, and vanished into speed. A beat later, the second destroyer fired its own pair, 4 interceptors now racing outward to meet whatever was coming inward. On Abraham Lincoln's bridge, the captain watched the tactical display update, 4 blue arcs reaching toward 4 red symbols. Simple geometry.
Life or death math.
At 5:16, the first intercept registered. One of the SM-2s found its target at range, and the inbound track disintegrated into a scatter of fragments that the radar briefly painted as a cloud before they fell below detection.
Track 1, killed.
The CIC logged it without emotion. But tracks 2 through 5 were still alive and still closing, and the picture was about to get worse. Because the Hawkeye had just revised its count.
Not 4 to 6 inbound, 8, possibly 9.
A second wave of launches had occurred 20 seconds after the first, from a different point along the coast, staggered in timing and bearing to arrive at the strike group from slightly different angles. This was not a volley. It was a coordinated barrage designed to saturate the defense from multiple vectors simultaneously. The Air Warfare Commander aboard Abraham Lincoln absorbed the update and adjusted without pause. He had trained for this. Every officer in that room had trained for this. The nightmare scenario for a carrier strike group was not a single missile. A single missile was a problem with a solution. The nightmare was volume, enough inbound threats arriving fast enough and spread wide enough to overwhelm the interceptors, exhaust the close-in defenses, and put at least one warhead onto steel. Iran had just tried to build that nightmare. At 5:17, the escorts were firing continuously. SM-2s and SM-SIXS left the rails in pairs, each one assigned to a specific track, each one burning toward a different piece of the incoming swarm. The sky over the northern Gulf flickered with distant intercepts, brief white flashes that looked almost beautiful from the flight deck if you did not understand what they meant.
2 more tracks died, then a third.
But the barrage had been designed with redundancy. For every missile the Americans killed, another was still flying, still skimming the surface, still driving toward 5,000 people and 100,000 tons of steel. One of the inbound tracks dropped so low it merged with the sea return on radar. For 4 seconds it simply ceased to exist on every scope in the strike group. The electronic warfare officer aboard the cruiser swore once, quietly, into his headset. Then the Hawkeye reacquired it, lower than before, faster than it should have been at that altitude. The track had descended into the wave tops and accelerated for its terminal run. That missile was now aimed at the carrier. The forward destroyer shifted fire. 2 SM-2s redirected toward the low-flyer. One of them lost guidance in the clutter and self-destructed harmlessly. The other found the edge of the target's radar cross-section but detonated late, behind the missile, close enough to damage but not to kill. The track wobbled on the display. It slowed by a fraction. Then it steadied and kept coming. Aboard Abraham Lincoln, the CWS mounts woke up. The Phalanx close-in weapon system is the last door between an inbound missile and the ship it wants to kill. It is a 6-barreled 20mm Gatling gun married to its own radar, and it thinks faster than any human in the loop. When it activates, the sound is distinctive, a rising mechanical whine that climbs in pitch until it becomes a scream, and then the scream becomes a roar as the barrels spin to full speed and begin throwing tungsten at 4,000 rounds per minute. Every sailor on the ship heard it. In the berthing compartments. In the engine rooms.
In the mess halls.
In the magazine spaces deep below the waterline where men sat surrounded by high explosives and had nothing to do but listen. The CIWS on the starboard side engaged at 5:18. The burst lasted less than 3 seconds. 3 seconds of continuous fire that turned the air between the ship and the sea into a wall of metal fragments so dense that nothing could pass through it intact. The missile hit that wall at just under the speed of sound. It came apart 600 yards from Abraham Lincoln's hull. The explosion was low and flat. A hard orange flash followed by a spray of burning debris that scattered across the water in a fan pattern that reached close enough to spatter the hull with fragments. Sailors on the sponson level felt the heat. One of them described it later as standing too close to a bonfire that someone had thrown a car battery into.
The ship shuddered.
Not from impact, but from the pressure wave and from the CWS recoil and from 5,000 people collectively holding their breath and then releasing it.
Track killed. Terminal defense successful.
But the morning was not done with them. At 5:19, while the last missile fragments were still hissing into the Gulf, surface search radar aboard the southern destroyer painted a new problem. Contacts emerging from the Iranian coastline at high speed.
Small, fast, multiple.
Not missiles this time.
Boats.
IRGCN fast attack craft. The kind of vessel Iran had spent decades perfecting for exactly this scenario. Shallow draft speedboats armed with rockets, short-range anti-ship missiles, and in some cases nothing more than a crew willing to close range and create chaos.
They were cheap.
They were expendable. And in the confined geometry of the strait, they were genuinely dangerous.
The first count was 7.
Within a minute, it revised to 11. They came from 3 different points along the coast, not in a single wave but in staggered groups that forced the strike group to divide its attention across a wide arc. Some held back at medium range, circling, watching. Others drove straight in, throwing up white rooster tails of wake as they accelerated toward the formation's outer ring. The swarm had arrived at the worst possible moment. The escorts had just expended interceptors on the missile barrage. Reload cells were cycling. Crews were still processing battle damage from the close intercept, and now they had to pivot from air defense to surface warfare without missing a beat. Aboard the screening destroyer, the captain made a judgment that would later be studied in tactical classrooms. He split his weapons systems. Aegis stayed oriented skyward in case another missile salvo was coming. The 5-inch gun and the ship's smaller weapons trained outward toward the approaching boats. He was betting that the swarm and the missiles were 2 halves of the same attack, and that committing everything to one threat would leave him naked against the other.
He was right.
At 5:20, as the first fast boats crossed within 5 nautical miles of the formation, another pair of missile launches bloomed on the Hawkeye's scope.
Inland.
Same coastal corridor. Smaller signatures this time, possibly shorter range weapons, but fired while the strike group's attention was being dragged toward the surface. The timing was precise enough to suggest a single coordinating hand somewhere on shore, watching, waiting, sequencing each layer to arrive when the Americans were most distracted. The second missile pair met SM-6 interceptors that the cruiser had been holding in reserve for exactly this contingency. Both inbound tracks died at range.
Clean kills. No drama.
But the expenditure was real. The strike group's magazine depth was not infinite, and every interceptor fired was one fewer available for whatever came next. On the surface, the fast boats were now close enough to see through binoculars from Abraham Lincoln's Island. Small dark shapes cutting white lines across gray water. They looked absurd against the backdrop of a nuclear-powered supercarrier. They looked like insects approaching a cathedral. But the men watching them did not feel safe, because they had read the history. They knew what the USS Cole looked like after a single small boat reached its hull. They knew what happened in the Millennium Challenge wargame when simulated swarm tactics sank a carrier in a simulation that the Navy had tried very hard to forget. Bridge-to-bridge warnings went out on open channels. Unidentified military vessels approaching United States naval formation. You are standing into danger. Alter course immediately. No response from any of them. At 5:21, The MH-60R Seahawk that had been turning rotors on the flight deck launched into a sky still smudged with smoke from the earlier intercepts. It dropped low over the water and banked toward the nearest cluster of fast boats, feeding live video back to the strike group. The imagery confirmed what radar had suggested. Several boats carried visible weapons mounted forward. At least 2 showed crew activity around what appeared to be launcher rails. One was trailing something in the water that the helicopter crew could not immediately identify. The destroyer screening the carrier's starboard side fired a warning burst from its forward gun. The 5-inch round hit the water 300 yards ahead of the lead boat, throwing up a column of spray tall enough to be visible from the carrier. The message was unambiguous. The lead boat did not alter course. It accelerated. The second round was not a warning. It struck the boat just forward of amidships. Through the helicopter's camera feed, the strike group watched the small vessel buckle, shudder, and begin to burn. Its wake collapsed. It wallowed once to starboard, then settled lower in the water as smoke poured from the shattered hull. The crew was either gone or going. Nobody aboard the destroyer watched long enough to determine which. 2 boats behind the leader broke hard. One turned away. The other hesitated, drifted broadside to the formation for a long 5 seconds, then turned as well. But the flanking groups did not break. They adjusted, spreading wider, staying just outside the range where the escorts had demonstrated they would kill, probing for a seam. At 5:23, one of the flanking boats fired. It was a short-range weapon, possibly a C-704 derivative, launched from a rail so small that the Seahawk crew did not identify it until the exhaust trail was already visible. The missile covered the distance between the boat and the outer escort in seconds. The destroyer's CWS engaged automatically, and the weapon disintegrated in a burst of fragments that peppered the ship's superstructure with shrapnel.
No penetration. No casualties.
But the sound of metal hitting metal at velocity echoed through the destroyer's bridge, and for the crew, the distinction between a near miss and a hit became academic. The destroyer returned fire immediately. Not with the 5-inch gun this time, but with a harpoon. The response was wildly disproportionate in terms of cost and capability, $1 million anti-ship missile aimed at a fiberglass speedboat. But proportionality was no longer the governing principle. The principle was now suppression. The harpoon covered the distance in a flat, screaming arc and hit the offending boat at waterline. The detonation was massive relative to the target. The boat ceased to exist in any recognizable form. What remained was burning debris scattered across a circle of churning water. The other boats saw it. Every one of them saw it. And within 60 seconds, the swarm began to dissolve. Boats peeled off in 1s and 2s, turning back toward the coast, their wakes curving away from the formation like fingers uncurling from a fist. By 5:26, the surface picture was clearing, but the captain of Abraham Lincoln was no longer looking at the boats. He was looking at the coast. The real threat had never been the missiles or the boats alone. It had been the system behind them, the radars that had guided the first salvo, the communication nodes that had sequenced the swarm, the launchers that might still hold reloads, the command structure that had orchestrated the entire attack with enough precision to layer missiles, boats, and timing into a single coherent assault on a United States aircraft carrier. If that system survived the morning, it would try again. Maybe not today, maybe not this week, but it would try again. The captain's order was brief: launch the strike package. At 5:28, the flight deck of Abraham Lincoln transformed for the 3rd time that morning. It had gone from launch posture to emergency defense to survival mode. Now it shifted to something older and more fundamental.
Retaliation.
Catapult crews who had been crouching behind blast deflectors stood and moved to their stations. Steam pressure built in the catapult tracks. Yellow shirts guided the first Super Hornet forward, its wings unfolding as it rolled, weapons visible beneath them, 2,000-pound dams and a targeting pod that could read a license plate from 15,000 feet. The shooter touched the deck. The holdback released. The catapult fired. And the first strike aircraft left Abraham Lincoln's bow with a sound like the sky tearing open. 3 more followed in under 2 minutes. Then the Growler. The electronic warfare aircraft climbed out on a separate vector, its jamming pods already warming, its crew already mapping the Iranian electromagnetic order of battle from memory and from the data the Hawkeye was pouring into their systems. The strike package formed up over the Gulf and turned northeast.
Toward the coast.
Toward the launchers. At 5:33, the Growler began its work. Iranian coastal radars that had been sweeping confidently 10 minutes earlier found their signals bending, fracturing, drowning in noise. Tracking beams that had guided the morning's missile barrage stuttered and lost coherence. Communication links between shore batteries and their command nodes filled with phantom signals. The electromagnetic environment along the Iranian coast, which had been clear and organized during the attack, became a hall of mirrors. Behind the Growler, the Super Hornets descended to strike altitude and began their search. The first target appeared at 5:35, a mobile radar vehicle parked in a prepared revetment near the coast, its antennas still oriented toward the strait. The targeting pod locked on. The pilot confirmed the identification against the Hawkeye's earlier emissions data.
The coordinates matched. The radar type matched.
This was one of the systems that had guided the missiles that had nearly hit his ship.
The JDAM fell clean.
The explosion erased the revetment, the vehicle, and 30 meters of surrounding terrain in a single convulsion of dirt and fire. A secondary detonation followed, smaller but sharp, probably a generator or a fuel cache. The smoke column rose vertically in the still morning air. At 5:37, a second target resolved. A launcher site tucked into a wadi 2 kilometers inland. The camouflage netting over it had been hastily repositioned, suggesting the crew had attempted to relocate after their first salvo and had not moved fast enough. Through infrared, the launcher vehicle glowed hot. It had fired recently. The heat signature was unmistakable. 2 Super Hornets prosecuted the target simultaneously, each dropping a single weapon from offset angles to ensure coverage. The twin impacts bracketed the launcher position and collapsed it. The secondaries were spectacular. Missile propellant ignited in a chain that sent flame shooting laterally out of the wadi like a blowtorch laid on its side. Whatever reload missiles had been stored nearby cooked off in a series of staggered blasts that continued for nearly a minute. At 5:40, the strike lead identified what appeared to be a command and control node, a cluster of vehicles with communication masts and antenna arrays positioned on a low rise with line of sight to both the coast and the inland road network. Personnel were visible, moving between vehicles in what looked like evacuation. They were too late. The weapon arrived before the last vehicle could move. The strike was clean and total. The node went dark on every sensor in the strike group's network simultaneously.
One more site.
At 5:43, farther south along the coast, a final radar emission spiked briefly. A search radar attempting to reacquire the American aircraft. The Growler smothered it electronically, and a trailing Super Hornet put a weapon on the source 30 seconds later. The emission stopped permanently. By 5:45, the strike package was turning for home. Below them, the Iranian coastal corridor that had opened the morning with coordinated aggression was silent. Smoke rose from 4 separate sites. The electromagnetic spectrum along the shore was empty where it had once been crowded with threat signals. The system that had orchestrated the attack, radar, launchers, command, communications, existed now only as wreckage and data points in American intelligence files. The recovery aboard Abraham Lincoln began at 5:48. One by one, the strike aircraft descended into the pattern, caught the wire, and rolled to a stop on the same flight deck that had been a target less than 40 minutes earlier. Pilots climbed out and walked to debrief.
No fist pumps.
No victory poses. Maintenance crews swarmed the jets immediately, checking for damage, beginning the turnaround cycle for whatever came next. Because no one believed it was over. In the Combat Information Center, analysts were already building the timeline. The attack had lasted approximately 14 minutes from first launch detection to last surface engagement. In that window, Iran had fired an estimated 8 to 9 anti-ship cruise missiles from at least 2 separate coastal battery positions, deployed 11 fast attack craft in a coordinated swarm maneuver, launched at least 1 short-range missile from a surface vessel, and maintained fire control quality radar illumination of the strike group throughout the engagement. The American response had destroyed all inbound missiles, sunk or disabled 2 fast attack craft, driven the remaining swarm back to the coast, and eliminated 4 confirmed military targets ashore, including 2 missile launcher sites, 1 radar vehicle, and 1 command node. 0 American casualties. 0 structural damage to the carrier. Minor fragmentation damage to 1 escort destroyer. Magazine expenditure, significant but sustainable. The engineering crew, meanwhile, had finally isolated the ruptured steam line. On the bridge of Abraham Lincoln, the captain stood where he had stood all morning. The coffee in his hand had gone cold hours ago. He set it down on the chart table without looking at it. Outside the bridge windows, the Strait of Hormuz stretched ahead, narrow and bright under the climbing sun. Shipping traffic was already beginning to reappear on radar, commercial vessels that had scattered at the first sign of military action now cautiously resuming their routes. The carrier kept moving. It did not slow. It did not turn. It drove forward through the choke point at the same speed and on the same course it had planned before the first alarm sounded. 5,000 people aboard. Jets on the deck. Escorts on the flanks. Radars turning. The strait was quiet again. But quiet in the Strait of Hormuz is not the same as safe. It is the space between what just happened and what might happen next. The strike group understood that distinction in a way that no briefing could teach and no simulation could replicate. They understood it because they had lived it, because for 23 minutes that morning, the mathematics of survival had been calculated in real time by real people aboard real ships, and the answer had come back in their favor by margins measured in seconds and hundreds of yards. Iran had opened the morning by attacking a symbol. By mid-morning, the symbol had answered. Not with rhetoric, not with restraint calibrated for cameras. With precision, with layered defense, with counterstrike, and with the quiet relentless machinery of a force that had spent 70 years preparing for exactly this kind of fight in exactly this kind of water. The smoke on the coastline would fade by afternoon. The intelligence files would not. And the next time an Iranian battery commander looked at his radar scope and saw an American carrier transiting the strait, he would remember what happened to the last team that pressed the button. Abraham Lincoln cleared the Strait of Hormuz at 6:14 local time. Behind her, the water closed over the morning as if nothing had happened at all. But inside the hull, in the CIC logs, in the pilot's debriefs, in the maintenance records and the ammunition tallies and the quiet conversations between sailors who had heard the CWS scream for real, the morning would last a very long time.
The ship sailed on. The mission continued.
And somewhere below decks, an engineering team finally secured the steam line repair and filed a work order that would be the most boring document produced aboard USS Abraham Lincoln that day. Nobody would read it for weeks. At 5:41 local time, a single radar return blinks on the portside scope aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln and vanishes before the operator can tag it. Then it comes back. Then 6 more appear behind it, fanning out across the mouth of the Strait of Hormuz like fingers spreading across a table. By the time the surface warfare coordinator opens his mouth, the count is already at 14 and climbing. The words come flat and quick. Multiple fast surface contacts bearing 086 through 110. Range 9 nautical miles. Closing. Nobody aboard the Lincoln needs that sentence explained.
Not in this water. Not at this hour.
The Strait of Hormuz is 21 nautical miles wide at its narrowest point. The shipping lanes are tighter. The navigable depth for a Nimitz-class carrier tighter still. 100,000 tons of American warship threading a keyhole, while the Iranian coastline sits close enough on both sides to watch it happen with binoculars. This is where geography becomes a weapon, and the Iranians have been studying that weapon for 40 years. On the bridge, the captain shifts his gaze from open water to the repeater display. The carrier holds course. 2 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers ride escort, one forward to starboard, one slightly aft to port. Each one displaces roughly 9,200 tons and carries enough firepower to dismantle a small navy. Together they form a moving wall around the carrier, sensors pulling in more data per second than any human eye could process in an hour. From the flight deck, the morning still looks calm. Blue water, low sun, shadows stretching across parked Super Hornets. But the calm is a photograph from 3 minutes ago. The situation underneath it has already changed. Inside the Combat Information Center, the contact picture builds with the kind of speed that empties stomachs.
18 tracks, 22, 27.
Then the number that locks the room into a different posture entirely. 30 confirmed fast surface contacts. Multiple attack profiles. No commercial lane adherence.
No separation. No drift pattern.
These boats are not fishing and they are not lost. They are forming into 3 distinct clusters, each one using speed and geometry like components of the same machine. One cluster pushes wide toward the starboard flank. Another slides low off the port quarter. The third group drives straight up the centerline, not aimed at the escorts but at the water the carrier itself is about to occupy. The message is not subtle. They are not trying to harass. They are trying to saturate. An Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps fast attack craft costs somewhere between $50,000 and $200,000 depending on the variant. The USS Abraham Lincoln cost $4.5 billion. 30 of those boats together represent maybe $6 million in total hardware, the price of a single jet engine on one of the aircraft chained to the flight deck above. And right now, that $6 million is trying to take a $4.5 billion airfield off the board. On the starboard catwalk, a bosun's mate watches through binoculars. 30 seconds ago he could only see wakes. Now he can make out hull shapes, low profiles, open tops, men packed tight in each boat, spray exploding over their bows as they hammer through the morning chop. They are not slowing down. 5:44 local time. Range drops below 7 nautical miles. In CIC, a petty officer begins tagging threat priorities based on speed, heading, and spacing. Some boats ride bow high, light, and fast. Others sit heavier in the water with more men aboard and more bulk lashed to their decks. One contact yaws across a wave and the electro-optical camera catches a shape under a tarp near the bow. Long, tubular, angled forward. Not enough for a positive identification. Enough to log and remember. The first radio hail goes out from the starboard destroyer. Unidentified Iranian small craft. This is United States Navy warship operating in international waters. Alter course immediately and maintain safe distance. English first, then Farsi.
No response. A second hail. Nothing. A third.
The boats keep closing. The silence is its own kind of answer. 3 nautical miles to the northeast, a commercial tanker loaded with 2 million barrels of crude oil moves through its assigned lane at 12 knots, oblivious or pretending to be. The entire global economy is threading the same needle as the carrier group. and the Iranians have chosen this morning to tie a knot in it. 5:46 local time. Lead elements cross inside 5 nautical miles. The destroyer off the starboard bow adjusts course just enough to make the movement visible from the water.
Not aggressive, not hesitant, deliberate.
Its Mark 45 5-inch gun mount trains left, a 62 caliber barrel capable of putting a guided round through a window at 15 nautical miles. Right now it is pointed at boats close enough to hit with a baseball. A Seahawk helicopter lifts from the aft escort, nose dipping immediately toward the inbound contacts. In CIC, every track now carries a number and every number carries a priority. The captain speaks for the first time.
Set armed response stations. Hold course.
Nobody fires unless they cross the line. No one asks where the line is. They already know. The swarm keeps closing. 3 clusters, 30 hulls, all converging on one of the largest warships on Earth. And from the flight deck, the men watching can now see clearly enough to understand what this is.
Not a provocation. Not a test.
This is the opening move. 5:47 local time. What the swarm does not know, what the men in those boats hammering across the chop cannot see from water level, is that the Abraham Lincoln's air wing began repositioning 90 seconds ago. 2F divided by a -18E Super Hornets, already airborne on a routine combat air patrol 40 nautical miles to the south, have turned north and gone to full military power. At 1,190 miles per hour, they will be overhead in less than 2 minutes. And below the flight deck, in the carrier's tactical spaces, a second Seahawk is spinning up.
Not for search, for prosecution.
What Iran planned as an overwhelming numbers game is about to become a layered kill box with American platforms stacked from the waterline to 25,000 feet. The boats are already inside the geometry of their own destruction. They just do not know it yet.
The surface picture sharpens.
The 3 clusters are now separating into functional layers. Outer boats cross back and forth at the edge of the formation, complicating the radar picture with clutter and false vectors. Middle boats press toward the destroyers, forcing each escort to track multiple bearings simultaneously. The inner group, the dangerous group, keeps driving for the water immediately around the carrier. The Iranians have studied American doctrine. They know the escorts will not abandon the carrier to chase individual boats. They know the carrier will not make violent course changes in a restricted channel. They know that every second of indecision compresses the available water. Their plan is elegant. Overload the decision cycle. Force the Americans to choose between shooting early and looking like aggressors or shooting late and absorbing hits. Make the geometry so tight that any response creates a gap somewhere else. It is a genuinely brilliant piece of asymmetric thinking. It accounts for American firepower, American rules of engagement, American caution in a confined waterway. It accounts for everything except what happens when the Americans are not cautious at all. 5:49 local time. The Seahawk drops low and surges ahead of the escort screen. Rotor wash flattens the water beneath it as the nose camera feeds live imagery straight into CIC. 12 boats in the lead cluster. Multiple armed personnel visible. One boat with a mounted heavy machine gun. Another with what appears to be a rocket rack fixed near the bow. 2 more carrying extra fuel drums or ammunition cans lashed to their sterns. Then the report that shifts the room. Lead contact from port cluster has uncovered a launcher-shaped object. Repeat, launcher-shaped object. The port destroyer angles outward to widen the defensive arc. Its wake curls white behind it. The message is clear. You are not getting closer for free. 5:50 local time. Range to nearest contact drops to 1.8 nautical miles. The details now are ugly and precise. Men crouched behind shield plates. Faces wrapped. Weapons slung. Hull slamming wave crests so violently that spray erupts over the bows and soaks everyone aboard. They are operating on the ragged edge of control, and that is exactly what makes them dangerous. A crew-served weapon does not need to be accurate when the target is the size of a shopping mall. The electronic warfare operator breaks silence from CIC. Short-duration radar sweep from starboard lead element.
Low power.
Could be fire control queuing.
Could be.
That word sits in the air for half a second. In Hormuz, half a second is a luxury. The captain gives the next order without raising his voice. Graduated response authorized. Warning line is crossed. 5:52 local time. A warning flare streaks from the starboard destroyer, arcing low across the haze and dropping ahead of the lead Iranian boat. Red light reflects off spray and steel.
Turn away now. The boat does not turn. It accelerates.
2 more surge alongside it, using the flare not as a deterrent but as a distance marker. They know exactly how close they are. They want to be closer. Then the first hostile act becomes unmistakable. A flash breaks from one boat in the starboard cluster. Small, sharp, low over the water. Something strikes the sea off the destroyer's bow and kicks up a narrow column of spray. That is not a warning shot. That is not a misunderstanding. Engage designated hostile contacts. The order moves through the formation like voltage through copper. On the destroyer's starboard wing, a gunner opens with a controlled burst from a mounted 50 caliber weapon.
Not spray fire.
A measured line stitched across the water ahead of the lead boat, then into the hull when it refuses to break. Rounds punch through fiberglass and aluminum.
The bow digs.
One engine detonates in a burst of gray smoke. The hull rolls hard to port and disappears behind its own spray. The Seahawk is already overhead. Its door gunner fires a tight burst across the next boat's bow. A tube-shaped launcher vanishes in splinters. The hull hooks violently left and nearly throws 2 men overboard. Somewhere in Tehran, someone just found out the difference between a war game and a war. 5:53 local time.
The swarm does not retreat. It splits.
Outer boats swing wide, forcing the escorts to choose between immediate threats and flanking runs. Inner boats push harder, gambling that speed and chaos can still crack the defensive ring. Then the first rocket launches. It comes from a boat masked in the middle layer, farther out than the others. The smoke trail is brief and unstable. The weapon skips above the waterline, passes wide of the destroyer, and detonates off the port side in a low orange blast that throws spray across empty ocean.
No hit.
But the rules of the engagement just changed permanently. 40,000 feet above the strait, the 2 Super Hornets arrive on station. From that altitude, the entire surface battle looks like a diagram. White wakes crisscrossing blue water, smoke columns rising from disabled hulls, the massive gray shape of the Lincoln pushing through the center of it all. The lead pilot checks in with the carrier's tactical controller. They are not here to drop ordnance on speedboats. They are here because of what might come next. The coastal anti-ship missile batteries embedded along the Iranian shoreline, the ones that have been warming up their radar for the last 4 minutes. What the Iranian boats were supposed to do was force the carrier to stop, to turn, to break formation. What they were supposed to create was a stationary target for the shore-based NOR anti-ship missiles waiting in their launchers 35 nautical miles to the north. Each NOR is a Chinese-derived C-802 variant carrying a 363-pound warhead at 680 miles per hour, skimming 20 feet above the waterline. Against a maneuvering carrier with full escort coverage and airborne early warning, the odds are long. Against a carrier that has stopped to deal with a swarm attack in a 21-mile-wide channel, the math changes dramatically.
That was the plan.
The boats were the Matador's cape. The missiles were the sword. What Iran did not know was that an E-18G Growler, the Navy's electronic warfare aircraft, had been orbiting at 28,000 feet since before dawn. Its ALQ-99 jamming pods had mapped every Iranian radar emission along the coast for the last 90 minutes. The shore batteries were not hidden. They were catalogued, prioritized, and already assigned to a strike package that could execute in under 4 minutes. The sword was visible before the cape ever moved. 5:54 local time. 6 Iranian boats are now dead in the water, burning, broken, or rolling in their own debris. But the surviving boats begin to adapt. They stop charging in straight lines. They cross each other's wakes, use offset angles, try to overload visual tracking. One group feints toward the destroyers. Another cuts toward commercial traffic farther north, using civilian hulls as background clutter. The carrier strike group answers not with more firepower, but with something worse.
Patience.
The escorts shift to sector engagement, each destroyer owning a quadrant, the Seahawk marking boats that still show closing intent. The Americans stop reacting boat by boat and start dismantling the swarm as a pattern.
6 o'clock local time.
The surviving Iranian boats are no longer one threat. They are fragments.
Some still press forward. Some hesitate.
Some are plainly looking for a way out that does not look like running. The early aggression is gone. What replaced it is doubt, and doubt is fatal in a close-range fight. A 5-boat cluster off the starboard quarter tries the smartest move of the morning. They exploit a seam between the carrier's wake and the forward destroyer's coverage arc, timing their run to coincide with 2 decoy boats feinting east. The Seahawk catches it instantly. The helicopter dives across the lead boat's bow, rotor wash blasting spray into the crew's faces.
They flinch.
That half-second flinch breaks their timing. The destroyer's guns open in the same heartbeat. The lead hull disintegrates. The second boat swerves into the wake turbulence and slams off a wave so hard a man is thrown against the weapon mount behind him. The third finds the carrier's security ring already closed. A burst walks across its engine block.
Smoke pours out. Speed dies.
The remaining 2 peel off. The formation ceases to exist in under 10 seconds. Iran spent 40 years developing swarm doctrine for this strait. The Americans unraveled it in 10 seconds of coordinated geometry.
6:04 local time.
One final cluster makes its run. 5 boats, tight-packed, driving for the gap between the carrier and the aft escort. It is the most dangerous attempt since the fight began. If a single hull penetrates the inner ring, the entire engagement calculus shifts. The Americans are waiting. The Seahawk pins the lead boat with optics. The aft escort slides left to narrow the corridor. The forward destroyer holds pressure on the outer contacts. Every American platform does a different piece of the same job at the same instant. The lead boat presses anyway. It gets closer than any hull has gotten all morning. Then the escort fires. A short burst tears into the bow. The hull lifts, stalls, and slaps back into white water. The second boat turns away immediately. The third overcorrects and slams sideways into the debris field. The last two never reach the line. 6:05 local time. CIC to bridge. Outer security ring re-established. That single sentence means the swarm has failed. More than half the Iranian boats are destroyed, disabled, or scattered beyond the zone that mattered. The carrier has not changed course.
Not once. The formation is intact. The flight deck is undamaged.
The shore-based missiles never launched because the Growler overhead made it clear that firing would mean losing the batteries, the radar, and every operator sitting behind them. $6 million worth of fast attack boats came for a $4.5 billion aircraft carrier and did not make it stop, turn, or blink. The entire Iranian operation cost less than the fuel the Lincoln burned during the engagement.
6:10 local time.
The surviving boats retreat.
Some limp, some race. None hold formation.
The water behind them is marked with fuel sheen, drifting wreckage, and the widening distance between what they planned to do and what actually happened. The Abraham Lincoln continues its transit through the Strait of Hormuz.
Still guarded, still alert.
Still pulling data from every sensor in the formation. Off the starboard side, smoke from a disabled Iranian hull flattens in the rising heat and begins to dissolve into morning haze. Ahead, the water opens just enough to breathe. The swarm came in fast, loud, and committed. The American response came back slower, quieter, and absolute. 30 boats learned something in the Strait of Hormuz that morning.
Speed is a tactic. Discipline is a system. And a system does not flinch.
If you enjoyed this video, check out our other video on what happens when Iran's shore-based missiles actually launch against a carrier strike group.
Bye for now.
At 3:14 local time, a single BGM-109 Tomahawk Block V cruise missile cleared the forward vertical launch cell of the USS Philippine Sea, a Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruiser holding station in the central Persian Gulf, 140 nautical miles southwest of Bandar Abbas. The booster kicked it off the rail and fell away.
Wings deployed. The turbofan caught air.
And 1,600 pounds of guided American foreign policy dropped to 50 feet above the waterline and turned northeast at 550 miles per hour toward something the United States government had not publicly acknowledged existed. The target was not on any map distributed to coalition partners. Not in any Pentagon press briefing. Not in any leaked target list making the rounds on Telegram channels where Iranian state media pretended to have sources. The target was a hardened underground facility 11 kilometers east of Isfahan, buried 80 feet beneath a complex that satellite imagery showed as a pharmaceutical packaging plant. The kind of building nobody looks at twice.
Which was the entire point.
Because underneath it, according to 14 months of signals intelligence and one extraordinarily well-placed human source, Iran had been operating a cascade hall containing 1,044 IR-6 centrifuges enriching uranium to 60% purity. The Tomahawk cost $2.1 million. The centrifuge hall it was pointed at represented roughly $800 million in infrastructure, research, and 2 decades of sanctions evasion. Somewhere in the Navy's accounting office, someone was about to have a very satisfying afternoon. But the Tomahawk was not going to reach Isfahan. It was never supposed to. Its job was to die loudly. 340 nautical miles to the northwest, above the Iraqi border region, a formation of 8 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers was entering Iranian airspace at 42,000 feet. Each one carried 16 GBU, 57 massive ordnance penetrators in its rotary launchers, 30,000-pound bunker busters designed to punch through 200 feet of reinforced concrete before detonating. At $3.5 million per bomb, the 8 aircraft together carried roughly $448 million worth of ordnance. The entire formation's radar cross-section registered on Iranian air defense screens as approximately nothing. The Tomahawk's job was simple: fly toward Isfahan making as much electromagnetic noise as a cruise missile can make. Let every radar between Bandar Abbas and the target track it, paint it, hand it off to the next battery. Let every Tor M1, every Bavar 373, every surviving S-300 crew orient their attention southeast. Let every phone call between IRGC air defense nodes carry the same message: incoming from the Gulf, bearing northeast, one target, track and engage. And while every antenna in western Iran stared at a $2.1 million decoy flying at 550 miles per hour, 8 aircraft worth $2 billion each would arrive from the opposite direction, carrying enough penetrating ordnance to rearrange the geology beneath Isfahan. Iran was about to learn the difference between seeing the threat and seeing the distraction. 130 kilometers south of Isfahan, the Tomahawk crossed into the engagement envelope of an Iranian Bavar 373 battery. The domestically produced long-range air defense system Tehran had spent a decade calling superior to the Russian S-300. The system's engagement radar, a modified version of the Sayed-4 missile's fire control set, detected the cruise missile at 112 kilometers. The battery commander did exactly what his training demanded. He acquired, tracked, transitioned to fire control, and launched 2 interceptors. Each Sayed-4 missile cost approximately $3.8 million. 2 of them, $7.6 million, now racing toward a target worth $2.1 million. The math was already working against Iran, and the real strike hadn't started yet. The Tomahawk didn't evade. It didn't need to. Its terrain-following algorithm kept it at 50 feet over the desert floor, which meant the Sayed-4s had to execute a terminal dive against a target hugging the ground clutter. The first interceptor's proximity fuse triggered 40 meters above the cruise missile, peppering it with fragments that severed the left wing. The Tomahawk cartwheeled into the desert floor southeast of Najafabad at 3:27 local time.
Kill confirmed.
The Bavar 373 crew celebrated. Their command network buzzed with confirmation. Threat neutralized, single cruise missile, origin assessed as naval platform in the Persian Gulf. The battery commander reported the engagement up the chain and began the 6-minute reset cycle to reload. What he didn't know was that his radar had been transmitting continuously for 94 seconds during the engagement sequence, and 390 kilometers to the northwest, an RC-135V Rivet Joint Electronic Intelligence aircraft orbiting over Iraqi Kurdistan had recorded every emission with a precision that would make the battery's next minute of existence very brief. 9,000 feet above the Zagros ridgeline, a pair of F-15E Strike Eagles out of Al-Dafra were already turning. Their APG-82 radars had the Bavar 373's coordinates before the Tomahawk's wreckage stopped burning. Each Strike Eagle carried 2 AGM-88G ARGMER missiles, the extended range variant of the old HARM, capable of Mach 2.5 and 300 kilometers of reach against radiating targets. The weapons officer in the lead aircraft confirmed the emission signature against the rivet joint's data match. He selected both weapons. The missiles dropped off the pylons, boosters igniting, accelerating past twice the speed of sound within 4 seconds. Each ARGMER cost $1.2 million. 2 missiles, $2.4 million. Headed for a battery that cost Iran somewhere north of $300 million to develop and $40 million to produce. The Bavar 373 crew had exactly the amount of warning that a radar warning receiver provides when it isn't turned on because you just shot down a cruise missile and you're running the post-engagement checklist.
Which is to say, none.
The first ARGMER struck the engagement radar antenna. The second hit the command vehicle 30 meters away. The battery ceased to exist as a functioning air defense system at 3:31 local time, 4 minutes after it celebrated its kill. 60 kilometers north, at the Isfahan facility, nothing had changed. The guards at the pharmaceutical plant's surface entrance were monitoring their phones for news. The underground facility's own security relied on concealment, not defense. No dedicated short-range air defense.
No point defense system.
The assumption had always been that nobody could strike what nobody could find. The B-2s were 14 minutes out. 240 kilometers west of Isfahan, the second layer of Iran's response was already reacting. 3 batteries of Tor-M1 short-range air defense systems, Russian-built, deployed around the Natanz enrichment complex, began receiving repositioning orders. IRGC Air Defense Command had assessed the Tomahawk as a precursor strike, which it was, and concluded the primary target was Natanz, which it was not. The Tor-M1S began displacing northeast, pulling the short-range air defense umbrella away from the western approach corridors and concentrating it around a facility that was not under threat. Iran was reinforcing the wrong castle. This was not an accident. 5 hours earlier, a burst transmission from a U.S. cyber operations unit at Fort Meade had injected false intelligence into an Iranian military communications node that the NSA had been sitting inside for 7 months. The message, formatted to match authentic IRGC dispatch protocols, reported American submarine activity consistent with a Tomahawk strike package assembling south of Natanz. The IRGC's intelligence directorate assessed it as credible because it matched the pattern they were already watching. The Tomahawk from the Philippine Sea. A single ship, a single missile, pointed at a nuclear facility.
The logic was clean.
The logic was wrong. Iran was playing chess against an opponent who had read their playbook and then rewritten the last chapter. At 3:38 local time, the lead B-2 Spirit, callsign Phantom 1, reached its initial point 22 kilometers northwest of the Isfahan facility. The aircraft was invisible to every radar system currently operating in Iranian airspace, which was now a significantly smaller number than it had been 24 minutes earlier. The B-2's APQ-181 radar, operating in synthetic aperture ground mapping mode, painted the terrain below with a resolution fine enough to distinguish the pharmaceutical plant's loading docks from its parking structures. The weapons system officer confirmed the target coordinates against the pre-mission imagery. The aim point was not the building. It was a specific GPS coordinate 80 feet below the building, corresponding to the center of the Cascade Hall's ceiling as mapped by ground-penetrating radar data collected by an RQ-170 Sentinel drone 3 months earlier. The GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator is not a subtle weapon. It is 20 feet of hardened steel casing wrapped around 5,300 pounds of explosive, guided by coupled GPS and inertial navigation, designed to do one thing: go through whatever is between it and the target and then detonate. It enters the ground at terminal velocity, punches through layer after layer of earth and concrete using its own mass and speed, and detonates at a depth calculated to collapse whatever cavity exists at that level. Think of dropping a telephone pole made of tungsten-reinforced steel from 8 miles up and then detonating a small apartment building's worth of explosive at the bottom of the hole it makes. Phantom 1 released 2 GBU-57s in sequence, 4 seconds apart. The bombs fell for 38 seconds. They struck the surface of the pharmaceutical plant's main structure at 3:39 local time, 2 seconds apart. The first penetrator punched through the roof, through 3 floors of empty packaging equipment that had never packaged anything, through a 6-foot reinforced concrete transfer slab, through 40 feet of compacted earth and rock, and detonated against the ceiling of the Cascade Hall. The blast fractured the ceiling across a 30-meter radius. The second penetrator followed the first weapon's path through already shattered material, reached the Cascade Hall itself, and detonated inside it. 1,044 IR-6 centrifuges, spinning at 60,000 revolutions per minute, disintegrated. The uranium hexafluoride gas in the Cascade piping, pressurized and toxic, mixed with superheated air from the detonation and vented through every fracture the bombs had created. The surface of the pharmaceutical plant buckled, then partially collapsed into the cavity below. On seismographs at the University of Tehran, 340 kilometers away, the event registered as a magnitude 3.1. 18 seconds later, Phantom 2 released its weapons against the facility's underground power distribution center, 200 meters southeast of the Cascade Hall. Without power, even undamaged centrifuges would take 6 months to spin back up. With this damage, the timeline was closer to never. But Iran's air defense network was not finished. 50 kilometers south of the strike, a mobile S-300 PMU-2 battery that had been repositioned from Shiraz 48 hours earlier was scanning. Its crew had not received the reposition order that sent the Tor M1S chasing Phantoms toward Natanz, because the fiber optic link connecting their sector to the IRGC's central command had been severed by a strike 3 days ago. They were operating on pre-war standing orders: defend Isfahan's southern approach.
Autonomous, disconnected, and competent.
The 92 N6 engagement radar swept the sky and found something it should not have been able to find: a B-2 Spirit at 42,000 feet. Not because the stealth had failed, but because Phantom 3 had opened its bomb bay doors 8 seconds earlier to release its weapons against a secondary target, and an open bomb bay on AB-2 multiplies the radar cross-section from the size of a bird to the size of a regional jet. For 8 seconds, the most expensive aircraft in human history advertised itself to anyone paying attention. The S-300 crew was paying attention. They transitioned from search to track in 22 seconds, fast even by Russian training standards. 248 N6 interceptor missiles cleared the rail at 3:41 local time. Each missile accelerating to Mach 6, 6 times the speed of sound, climbing toward a target that was already closing its bomb bay and becoming invisible again. The missiles had been given their initial target coordinates during launch. They would guide on those coordinates for the midcourse phase and then activate their own semi-active radar seekers for terminal guidance, relying on the ground radar to illuminate the target. The B-2 pilot, callsign Phantom 3, received the missile launch warning from the aircraft's /APR-50 defensive management system.
The bomb bay was closed.
The radar cross-section had collapsed back to baseline, but 2 missiles were already in the air with a last known position that was accurate to within 100 meters. Stealth does not make you disappear.
It makes you hard to find.
Hard is not impossible when someone knows exactly where to start looking. Phantom 3 broke left and descended, putting the aircraft's lowest signature aspect toward the incoming missiles. The AN/APR-50 began jamming the S-300's engagement radar, flooding it with false returns. At 42,000 feet and Mach 0.85, the B-2 is not a dogfighter.
It turns like a conference table.
The pilot had geometry and jamming and prayer, in approximately that order. 70 kilometers east, one of the F-15E Strike Eagles that had killed the Bavar 373 battery was already rolling in. The weapons officer had the S-300's emission on his scope from the moment it lit up. He had 1 ARGMER remaining.
1 shot.
The missile came off the rail and covered the distance in 91 seconds. But the 48 N6 interceptors were 34 seconds from reaching Phantom 3's last known position. The first 48 N6 reached the coordinates where Phantom 3 had been when the bomb bay was open. The aircraft was no longer there. The missile seeker activated and swept for a return. The jamming degraded the picture. The seeker found something, possibly the B-2's residual return, possibly a jam strobe, and corrected toward it. The proximity fuse detonated the warhead at a range the Air Force later classified. Phantom 3 reported no damage. The fragments had found air. The second 48 N6 was 6 seconds behind the first, correcting off updated radar data. The S-300's engagement radar was still transmitting, still trying to burn through the jamming to give the missile terminal guidance. The ARGMER struck the radar antenna at 3:42 local time. The emission died. The second 48 N6, now without guidance updates, went autonomous.
Its seeker swept, found nothing.
The missile's fuel burned out at 70,000 feet and it fell into the desert east of Isfahan, a $1.5 million missile returning to Earth as expensive debris. The S-300 battery, worth $115 million, had gotten closer to killing a B-2 than any air defense system in history. The margin was measured in seconds and classification levels. Iran's crew had done everything right. They had hidden, waited, caught the one moment of vulnerability, and executed a textbook engagement. They lost because the aircraft they were shooting at costs $2.1 billion and carries countermeasures designed by people who spend careers imagining exactly this scenario.
Skill against budget. Budget won. It usually does. By 3:48 local time, all 8 B-2s had released their ordnance. 128 GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators, each weighing 30,000 pounds, struck 6 separate underground facilities across the Isfahan complex within a 10-minute window. The combined ordnance weight exceeded 1.9 million kilograms. The Cascade Hall was gone. The power distribution center was gone. A tunnel network connecting the underground facilities to a dispersal site 4 kilometers east collapsed along 600 meters of its length. A centrifuge assembly workshop buried under a motor pool was now a crater. 2 decades of enrichment infrastructure, built in defiance of international sanctions, hidden beneath buildings designed to fool satellites, defended by air defense systems that cost billions and performed exactly as well as their operators could have hoped, was functionally destroyed in less time than it takes to order dinner. The B-2s turned west, climbing back to cruise altitude, bomb bays sealed, radar cross-sections shrinking back to the size of insects. They would land at Diego Garcia 9 hours later, where maintenance crews would discover that Phantom 3's left wing had taken a single fragment from the 48 N6 proximity detonation, a 3-centimeter piece of Russian steel embedded in the radar-absorbent skin of a $2.1 billion aircraft. The repair would cost $4.2 million and take 3 weeks. The fragment itself would end up in a display case at Whiteman Air Force Base, the most expensive souvenir in Air Force history. In Tehran, the ARGC's air defense commander was still processing reports. The Bavar 373 battery that killed the Tomahawk was gone. The S-300 that nearly killed a B-2 was gone. The Tor M1 batteries he had repositioned to Natanz had defended a facility that was never attacked, and the facility he had left uncovered was now registering on seismographs. He had played every card correctly against the threat he could see. The threat he couldn't see had come from the opposite direction, at 42,000 feet, carrying ordnance heavy enough to rearrange the Earth.
Iran's air defense network had been brilliant, disciplined, and aimed at a $2.1 million cruise missile, while $17 billion worth of stealth bombers rewrote the map behind them. The most expensive magic trick in military history, and the audience never saw the hands move. The enrichment program that had survived Stuxnet, survived sanctions, survived assassination, and survived diplomacy did not survive 10 minutes of B2s. Somewhere in a Northrop Grumman boardroom, next quarter's earnings call just got a new opening slide. If you enjoyed this video, check out our other video on how the F-35 nearly got ambushed over Tehran. Bye for now. At 2:14 local time, an Israeli Air Force F-35 Ayadir dropped below 200 feet over the Persian Gulf, 40 miles south of Bandar Abbas, and released a payload that had never been used in combat before. The pilot didn't see the target. He didn't need to. The aircraft's mission computer had already confirmed coordinates transmitted from a source the pilot would never be briefed on, locked the weapon, and initiated release sequencing before the jet even crossed into Iranian airspace. The weapon fell for 11 seconds. Then its engine ignited and it disappeared from the pilot's heads-up display entirely. He pulled into a 7G climbing turn back toward tanker airspace. His part was done. The weapon's part was just beginning. 6 seconds later, 190 miles to the north, an operator at Iran's Karg Island oil terminal noticed something unusual on his monitoring screen. A pressure reading in the main crude distribution manifold had dropped by 4%. He noted it in his log. He assumed it was a sensor fault. Karg Island processes roughly 90% of Iran's crude oil exports. On a normal day, 5 million barrels pass through its loading systems. This was not going to be a normal day. 1,200 miles to the west, at Nevatim Air Base in the Negev Desert, the operations center was running at full capacity. 47 personnel occupied stations in a room roughly the size of a basketball court. The air smelled like coffee and static electricity. 3 screens along the far wall displayed feeds from assets the Israeli Air Force doesn't publicly acknowledge having in theater. One of them showed a live infrared image of Karg Island from 62,000 feet. The operator watching it said nothing. He just marked a timestamp. 2:14 and 31 seconds. 700 miles southeast, in the waters off Fujairah, 3 commercial supertankers sat at anchor waiting for loading schedules. Each one carried roughly 2 million barrels of capacity. Each one was empty. They had been empty for 11 days. The shipping companies that owned them had received quiet advisories from their insurance underwriters to delay Persian Gulf transits. No reason was given. No reason needed to be. When Lloyd's of London tells you to wait, you wait. And in Washington, D.C., where it was still 5:14 in the evening of the previous day, a statement had been drafted but not yet released. The statement concerned the Strait of Hormuz. It contained exactly one sentence that would rearrange global oil markets within hours of its publication. The sentence had been reviewed by the National Security Council, the Secretary of Defense, and the President himself. It read in part that the United States would consider any hostile interdiction of commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz as an act requiring immediate and proportional military response. The word proportional was doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. It was about to do more. Back over the Persian Gulf, the weapon released from the F-35 I had covered 140 miles in just under 4 minutes. It was a variant of the Rampage air-to-surface missile, a supersonic precision munition with a range of approximately 190 miles and a warhead designed not for blast damage but for structural penetration. Think of a telephone pole made of tungsten and high explosive moving at Mach 2.4. It doesn't need to destroy everything. It just needs to hit the right thing. At 2:18 local time, it hit the right thing. The target was not a military installation. It was not a nuclear facility. It was not a government building. It was a 36-inch high-pressure crude oil pipeline junction at the southern edge of Karg Island's Tank Farm No. 3. This junction connected the main export pipeline to 3 of the island's 6 single-point mooring buoys, the floating loading stations where tankers connect to take on crude. Without this junction, those 3 buoys were dead metal in the water. Half of Karg Island's export capacity disappeared in a moment measured in milliseconds. The explosion itself was modest. A flash. A pressure wave that broke windows in a control building 400 meters away. Then a fire that burned at 1,100 degrees for the next 14 hours. The operator who had noted the pressure drop 4 minutes earlier now had a very different problem on his screen. He wasn't looking at a sensor fault. He was looking at zero flow across the entire southern distribution network. He reached for the emergency communications panel. The line was dead. That wasn't an accident. 70 seconds before the Rampage missile reached its target, an Israeli cyber operation that had been dormant inside Karg Island's communications infrastructure for an estimated 19 months activated a prepositioned payload. It didn't destroy the communication system. That would have been obvious and quickly repaired. Instead, it introduced a 5,000 millisecond delay on all outgoing signals from the island's primary and secondary communications nodes. 5 seconds. That doesn't sound like much. In the next 90 minutes, it would be enough. 320 miles to the northwest, a second strike was arriving. This one came from the Mediterranean. 2 Israeli F-15I RAM aircraft operating from a position over northern Syria had launched 4 Delilah cruise missiles 12 minutes earlier. The Delilah is slower than the Rampage, subsonic, about 600 miles per hour. But it has a capability the Rampage doesn't. It can loiter. It can circle a target area for up to 30 minutes, waiting for updated targeting data before committing to its final attack run. These 4 Delilahs were not circling. They were inbound and locked. Their target was the Abadan oil refinery complex in southwestern Iran, one of the oldest and most important refineries in the country. Abadan processes 400,000 barrels of crude per day. It sits on the Shat al-Arab waterway, 11 miles from the Iraqi border. The Delilahs were coming in from the west, below 100 feet, following the river. Iranian air defense coverage in Khuzestan province is dense. On paper, the province hosts 3 battalions of S-300 PMU-2 long-range surface-to-air missile systems, 2 batteries of Bavar 373 indigenous air defense systems, and multiple short-range point defense installations. On any other night, detecting 4 subsonic cruise missiles crossing the border at low altitude would have been difficult but possible, given the radar coverage overlaps designed into the network. On this night, it was impossible. Because at 2:11 local time, 3 minutes before the first Rampage hit Karg Island, every early warning radar in a 200-mile radius of Abadan experienced what would later be described as a catastrophic synchronization failure. This was the second cyber operation, and it was significantly more aggressive than the first. Rather than introducing delays, this payload attacked the timing protocols that allow multiple radar installations to coordinate their coverage and hand off tracking data between stations. Without synchronized timing, each radar station still functioned individually. Each one could still detect objects in its own sector. But none of them could talk to each other. And none of them could pass targeting data to the missile batteries that depended on that information to engage threats. Each radar operator saw pieces of the picture. None of them saw all of it. The 4 Delilahs threaded through the gaps like water through a cracked dam. At 2:22 local time, the first Delilah struck the main atmospheric distillation column at Abadan's Unit 2 processing facility. The second hit the adjacent crude desalting plant. The third struck a 200,000-barrel floating roof storage tank. The fourth missed its intended target by 40 meters and detonated on a maintenance road. The first 3 were enough. Within 6 minutes, fires were burning across an area the size of 4 football fields. Secondary explosions in the desalting plant sent burning hydrocarbons into the drainage system that fed into the Shat al-Arab waterway. A black cloud visible from Basra, Iraq, 30 miles away, began to climb. 600 miles to the east, Iran's response was already in motion. But it was the wrong response. At 2:16, 2 minutes after the Karg Island strike, Iran's Supreme National Security Council received initial reports of an explosion on the island. The information was fragmentary because of the communications delay. But the SNSC had anticipated an Israeli strike against its nuclear program for months. Every contingency plan, every prepositioned response, every retaliatory option was built around that assumption. The assumption was that any Israeli attack would target Natanz, Isfahan, or Fordow. The nuclear triad. Every wargame they had run, every scenario they had planned for, started with those 3 locations. At 2:19, a duty officer in Tehran ordered a general air defense alert across all nuclear-associated facilities. S-300 batteries at Natanz powered to full readiness. Bavar 373 units at Isfahan began sweep scanning. Fighter squadrons at Mehrabad and Tabriz were ordered to immediate alert status. Within 12 minutes, Iran had its most sophisticated air defense umbrella active and scanning. It was covering the wrong targets. No Israeli aircraft were within 400 miles of any nuclear facility. That was the point. 1,200 miles from Tehran, aboard the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower operating in the Gulf of Oman, the Carrier Strike Group's intelligence center was watching everything. They weren't participating. Not yet. Their role, for now, was to observe and to maintain a posture that the Pentagon described internally as conspicuous readiness. The Eisenhower had 2 squadrons of F divided by a -18E divided by F Super Hornets, a squadron of EA-18G Growlers electronic warfare aircraft, and an air wing that had been at elevated readiness for 9 days. Conspicuous readiness meant that Iranian intelligence could see the carrier group, could see its aircraft on the flight deck, could detect the electronic emissions of a strike group preparing for operations. It was meant to be visible. It was meant to create doubt. If Iran retaliated against Israel, would the Americans join? The answer was supposed to be unclear. Unclear is more powerful than certain. What Iran's intelligence services could not see was what was 200 miles behind the Eisenhower. 3 Ohio-class guided missile submarines, each one carrying 154 Tomahawk cruise missiles. That's 462 cruise missiles in a space roughly the size of a small parking lot, sitting quietly at 400 feet below the surface of the Arabian Sea. They had been in position for 6 days. They had received no launch orders. They had received one message, repeated daily for the last 4 days. 4 words: maintain current posture, stand by. Back in Washington, the statement about the Strait of Hormuz was released at 5:47 p.m. Eastern Time. Within 11 minutes, Brent crude futures spiked $14 per barrel. Within 30 minutes, the spike hit $22. Trading algorithms that had been watching for keywords including Hormuz, military response, and proportional triggered automated buying across every major commodity exchange simultaneously. By the time human traders at the London IC exchange started their morning 6 hours later, oil was at $127 per barrel and climbing. 24 hours earlier it had been at $89.
This was Story 1.
Israeli strikes on Iranian oil infrastructure. American threats regarding the Strait. A regional crisis with global energy implications. Every news network on the planet was running this story by 3 a.m. local time. Satellites were being repositioned. Analysts were being woken up. Retired generals were sitting in studio chairs explaining what they thought would happen next. What they didn't know was that the oil infrastructure was the distraction. The real operation had started 11 hours earlier, at 3 p.m. local time on the previous afternoon, and it had nothing to do with missiles, aircraft, or pipelines. At 3:02 p.m. the previous day, an Iranian-flagged container ship named the Shari Cord, a 40,000-ton vessel operating a regular route between Bandar Abbas and the port of Latakia in Syria, suffered what its crew reported as a catastrophic engine room failure approximately 15 miles inside the Strait of Hormuz.
The vessel lost propulsion. It began to drift.
The crew deployed an emergency anchor in one of the most congested shipping channels on Earth. The Strait of Hormuz at its narrowest point is 21 miles wide. The shipping lanes used by tanker traffic are 2 miles wide in each direction, separated by a 2-mile buffer zone. A 40,000-ton ship sitting dead in the water in one of those lanes is the maritime equivalent of a jackknifed tractor-trailer on a 2-lane highway. Traffic began to stack up almost immediately. By 4 p.m., 6 tankers were holding positions south of the disabled vessel, waiting for tugs. By 6 p.m., the number was 14. By midnight, 23 commercial vessels of various types were either holding position, diverting around the obstruction, or anchored in designated waiting areas. Iranian port authorities at Bandar Abbas offered tug assistance. The tugs arrived at 7:30 p.m. They connected lines. They attempted to move the Shari Cord.
The ship didn't budge.
The tugs reported that the vessel's anchor chain appeared to be fouled on something on the seabed. The anchor couldn't be retrieved.
The ship couldn't be towed.
Nobody in any Western intelligence service flagged this as unusual. Container ships break down. Anchors get fouled. It happens. The Strait of Hormuz experiences an average of 3 significant shipping disruptions per month.
This was routine. Annoying but routine. It was not routine. The Shari Cord's engine room failure had been manufactured. The anchor was not fouled on the seabed. It was functioning exactly as intended. The ship's purpose was not to transit to Latakia. Its purpose was to sit precisely where it was sitting for precisely as long as it was sitting there. Because directly beneath the Shari Cord, on the floor of the strait at a depth of 80 meters, sat something that had been placed there 14 weeks earlier by an Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy midget submarine. It was a mine.
But not a conventional naval mine. It was a rising mine, a weapon that sits on the seabed and upon activation, releases a torpedo that ascends to intercept a target passing overhead. This particular variant was the EM-52, a Chinese-designed system that Iran had been suspected of possessing since 2015 but had never confirmed. The EM-52 can engage targets in water up to 200 meters deep. Its torpedo component has a range of approximately 10 miles. There wasn't just one. There were 6. spaced at 1,500-meter intervals along the shipping lanes. The Shari cord was sitting on top of one of them, not because the ship was part of the mine deployment, but because the ship's position was intended to force tanker traffic into a predictable diversion pattern. When ships can't use the normal channel, they use the alternate channel. The alternate channel ran directly over 4 of the other 5 mines. It was a kill box, and 23 ships were slowly being herded into it. The American statement about the strait was not a coincidence. It was based on intelligence. 96 hours earlier, a signals intelligence platform operating from a facility in Bahrain had intercepted a burst transmission from a known IRGC Navy command node to 3 fast attack craft bases along the Iranian coast. The transmission was encrypted, but its structure matched a pattern that NSA analysts had catalogued 4 years earlier during a previous escalation. The pattern was associated with mine warfare activation.
Not deployment. Activation.
The mines were already in the water. What the transmission ordered was the arming sequence. A second intercept, from a different source, provided partial geographic coordinates. Those coordinates were in the Strait of Hormuz. They were verified within 12 hours by an underwater drone launched from a Virginia-class submarine operating in the Gulf of Oman. The drone, an autonomous system called Razorback, covered 45 miles of seabed and returned with sonar imagery confirming 6 bottom-mounted objects consistent with EM-52 mine profiles. That intelligence went from Bahrain to CENTCOM in Tampa to the Pentagon to the White House in less than 4 hours. The presidential statement about the strait was drafted the same day. The timing of its release, simultaneous with the Israeli strikes, was not a coincidence either.
It was coordinated. Not publicly. Not formally.
Through a channel that doesn't appear in any organizational chart. So there were now 2 crises unfolding simultaneously, and most of the world only knew about one of them. The visible crisis was the Israeli strikes on Iranian oil infrastructure.
Karg Island burning. Abadan burning.
Oil prices climbing. That crisis was loud, photogenic, and impossible to ignore. The invisible crisis was 6 mines in the Strait of Hormuz, a dead container ship sitting on top of one of them, and 23 vessels slowly repositioning into a pattern that would give Iran the ability to shut down 21% of the world's daily oil supply in under 3 minutes. In Tehran, the Supreme National Security Council was in emergency session.
The room was divided.
The strikes on Karg Island and Abadan were an act of war. There was no ambiguity about that. The damage to Karg alone would reduce Iran's oil export capacity by an estimated 40% for a minimum of 6 months. Abadan would take longer. The economic impact was staggering. Iran's oil revenue for the current fiscal year was projected at approximately $50 billion. 40% of export capacity gone meant roughly $20 billion in lost revenue. Annual. For at least a year. The math was not complicated. The IRGC commander present in the session argued for immediate activation of the strait contingency. The mines were armed. The fast attack craft were loaded with anti-ship missiles. 62 missile boats, each carrying 2 to 4 C-802 anti-ship cruise missiles, were dispersed along the Iranian coastline between Bandar Abbas and Jask. The total missile count exceeded 200. Against commercial shipping, those numbers were overwhelming. Tankers don't have countermeasures. They don't maneuver. They're 1,000-foot steel boxes moving at 15 knots. Even a 20% hit rate would mean 40 missiles finding targets. The strait would be closed within hours. Oil would hit $200 per barrel. Maybe $250. The economic damage to the West would dwarf what Israel had just done to Iran. The foreign minister argued the opposite. The American statement had changed the calculus. Closing the strait would not trigger an American diplomatic protest. It would trigger a military response. And unlike previous administrations that had drawn red lines and then negotiated around them, this White House had positioned assets that made the threat credible. The Eisenhower Strike Group was visible.
The statement was public.
The word proportional gave the Americans legal and political cover to do almost anything. What the foreign minister didn't know, and what the IRGC commander didn't know, was what was 200 miles behind the Eisenhower. Those 3 Ohio-class submarines. 462 Tomahawk cruise missiles. Proportional is an interesting word when you have 462 cruise missiles available. The debate in Tehran lasted 47 minutes. The decision was to activate Phase 1 of the strait contingency but not Phase 2. Phase 1 meant the fast attack craft would deploy from their bases and take up pre-assigned positions along the coast, visible to American surveillance, creating a threat posture. The mines would remain armed but not triggered. Phase 2, the actual mining and missile attacks on shipping, would be held in reserve as a deterrent. The logic was that the threat of closing the strait was almost as powerful as actually closing it, and significantly less likely to result in an American attack. It was a reasonable calculation. It had one flaw. The flaw was that Israel already knew about Phase 1. They knew because the communications network that carried the SNSC's orders to IRGC Navy Command was compromised. Not the encryption. The metadata. Israeli signals intelligence didn't know what the order said, but they knew when they were sent, from where, to whom, and the response patterns they generated. When 62 missile boats began leaving their berths within 20 minutes of the SNSC session ending, the pattern matched what Israeli intelligence had predicted for a strait closure posture. At 3:40 local time, roughly 90 minutes after the first strike on Karg Island, the Israeli operation entered its second phase. This phase had no missiles, no aircraft, and no explosions. It was conducted entirely in the electromagnetic spectrum. 4 Israeli Gulfstream G-550 aircraft modified for signals intelligence and electronic warfare, known as the Nachshon Shavit and Nachshon Item, had been orbiting in a racetrack pattern over the Red Sea at 41,000 feet since midnight. They had been silent until now. At 3:40, all 4 aircraft activated their electronic warfare suites simultaneously. The effect was immediate. Iranian naval communications along the entire southern coastline degraded by approximately 70%. The 62 fast attack craft that had just deployed from their bases suddenly couldn't talk to their command authority with any reliability. Some lost communications entirely. Others received garbled fragments. The boats were designed to operate independently if necessary, but their commanders had trained for a coordinated missile saturation attack. Without coordination, each boat was a single unit with 2 to 4 missiles. Individually, they were annoying. Collectively, they were devastating. Israel had just turned collectively into individually. At the same time, 400 miles to the east, something happened that nobody in Tehran or Jerusalem had planned for. The Shari Cord, the container ship sitting dead in the Strait of Hormuz, moved. Not because the tugs pulled it free. Because its anchor chain broke. Or more precisely, because the anchor chain was cut. A U.S. Navy explosive ordnance disposal team operating from a rigid hull inflatable boat that had been staged from the USS Nitsa, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer operating nearby, had placed a small shaped charge on the anchor chain at a depth of 30 meters. The charge detonated at 3:38 local time. The chain parted. The tugs, which were still connected, immediately began towing the now-free vessel south, out of the shipping lane. Within 20 minutes, the Shari Cord was clear. Traffic could resume through the normal channel. The normal channel that did not run over the mines. The Iranians recognized what had happened almost immediately. The anchor chain didn't break on its own. The timing, 2 minutes before the Israeli electronic warfare activation, was not a coincidence. Someone had coordinated this. The Shari Cord gambit was burned. But the mines were still in the water. And the mines were still armed. In Tampa, at CENTCOM headquarters, the mine problem was now the priority. 6 EM-52 rising mines in the world's most important shipping choke point. Each one capable of killing a supertanker. The standard approach to mine clearance is methodical. You send mine countermeasure vessels, MH-53EC Dragon helicopters towing minesweeping gear, unmanned underwater vehicles to locate and neutralize each mine individually. It takes days. Sometimes weeks. The strait couldn't be closed for weeks. Every day of closure cost the global economy roughly $2.5 billion. The non-standard approach was faster. And riskier. At 4:15 local time, AP-8A Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft operating from Naval Support Activity Bahrain arrived over the strait at 25,000 feet. It was carrying sonobuoys, expendable underwater sensors that could be dropped from the aircraft to create an acoustic picture of the seabed. Over the next 40 minutes, the Poseidon dropped 36 sonobuoys in a grid pattern covering the area identified by the Razorback drone's earlier survey. The sonobuoy data was relayed in real time to the Nitsa, which had the most advanced mine warfare software package in the strike group. Simultaneously, 2 MH-60R Seahawk helicopters launched from the Eisenhower carrying airborne mine neutralization systems, essentially remote-controlled underwater vehicles with explosive charges that could be guided to a mine and detonated. Each helicopter carried 2 neutralization vehicles. 4 vehicles. 6 mines. The math wasn't perfect. 50 miles to the south, a second underwater drone was launched from the Virginia-class submarine. This one wasn't mapping. It was carrying 4 lightweight charges specifically designed for bottom mine neutralization. The drone's transit time to the minefield was estimated at 90 minutes. Too long for the first pass. The helicopters would have to do what they could with 4 vehicles and hope the submarine's drone arrived in time for the remaining mines. At 4:55 local time, the first airborne mine neutralization vehicle reached its target. The mine was sitting in 75 meters of water, partially buried in silt. The neutralization vehicle positioned itself within 2 meters of the mine and detonated. The explosion was felt on the surface as a dull thump. Sonobuoy data confirmed the mine was destroyed.
1 down, 5 to go.
The second vehicle reached its target at 5:03. Successful detonation.
2 down.
The third vehicle experienced a guidance malfunction at 5:10 and drifted off course. The operator on the Seahawk attempted to regain control. The vehicle's battery died at 5:14. It sank to the seabed, useless. 3 vehicles expended.
2 mines destroyed. 1 failed.
The fourth and final vehicle was deployed at 5:18 toward the third mine. Successful detonation at 5:24.
3 mines neutralized. 3 remaining.
The helicopters had nothing left. The submarine drone was still 40 minutes out.
40 minutes.
In those 40 minutes, 3 armed mines sat in the shipping lanes of the Strait of Hormuz. 3 mines that could each destroy a supertanker. 3 mines that the Iranian IRGC Navy still had the ability to trigger remotely. And in Tehran, the argument about Phase 2 was starting again. The IRGC commander now had new information. The Americans had moved the Shari cord. The Americans were actively clearing the mines. The Iranian contingency was being dismantled in real time. If Phase 2 was going to happen, it needed to happen now, before the remaining mines were neutralized. The window was closing. 62 missile boats were in position, though many had degraded communications. The 3 remaining mines were armed and could be command detonated. The foreign minister's counter-argument was simpler now. The Americans were clearing the mines. That meant the Americans knew about the mines. That meant the American threat about the strait was not hypothetical. It was operational. If Iran triggered those mines or launched anti-ship missiles at commercial shipping, the response would not be a statement. It would be 462 Tomahawk cruise missiles. And those would not be aimed at oil infrastructure. They would be aimed at every IRGC Navy base, every missile storage facility, every command center, and every fast attack craft that could be located. The IRGC Navy would cease to exist as a functional force in approximately 90 minutes. There was also the question of China. China buys roughly 27% of Iran's oil exports. China had not been consulted about the strait contingency. China would not appreciate having its energy supply interrupted by an Iranian decision made in the heat of a crisis. Beijing's ambassador had already called twice. He had not been put through to anyone with decision-making authority. That was a mistake that would have consequences regardless of what happened in the next hour. At 5:45 local time, with dawn beginning to lighten the eastern horizon over the Gulf of Oman, the SNSC reached its second decision. Phase 2 would not be activated. The remaining mines would be left in place as a card to be played later, but not triggered. The fast attack craft were ordered to return to port. The strait would remain open. Iran would pursue its response through other channels.
Diplomatic, economic,
asymmetric. The IRGC commander left the session without speaking to anyone. His deputy, waiting in an anteroom, asked him what had been decided.
He said one sentence.
It wasn't recorded, but it was reported later by 3 separate sources with minor variations. The version most commonly cited translates roughly to, "We just paid $50 billion to learn that our Navy is a suggestion." He wasn't entirely wrong. The 62 missile boats were returning to port. The electronic warfare jamming from the Israeli Gulfstream aircraft had lifted once the boats began withdrawing, which confirmed for the IRGC that the jamming had been targeted and deliberate, not some broad-spectrum interference. The Israelis had known exactly which frequencies to hit. That meant they had been listening for a very long time. At 6:04 local time, the submarine-launched underwater drone reached the 4th mine. Successful neutralization.
At 6:22, the 5th.
At 6:41, the 6th and final mine was destroyed. The Strait of Hormuz was clear. The entire mine neutralization operation had taken 1 hour and 46 minutes from first vehicle deployment to last detonation. The standard timeline for clearing a minefield of that size in a contested environment was 5 to 8 days. CENTCOM's after-action report would later describe the operation as compressed but acceptable. An unofficial assessment from the EOD team that cut the Shari cord's anchor chain used different language. They called it stupid lucky. Back in the daylight, the visible damage was becoming clear. Satellite imagery of Karg Island showed a fire burning across the southern tank farm with a smoke plume extending 40 miles downwind. The pipeline junction was destroyed. 3 of 6 loading buoys were inoperable. Iranian emergency crews were on scene but struggling to contain the fire because the water supply system for the firefighting infrastructure drew from a pumping station that had been damaged by debris from the initial strike. A $3.2 million missile had knocked out a pipeline junction, 3 loading buoys, a control building, and a firefighting pumping station. Total estimated repair cost, $1.4 billion. Estimated repair time, 8 to 14 months.
Abaddon was worse.
The atmospheric distillation column is the heart of any refinery. Without it, crude oil is just crude oil. It can't be processed into gasoline, diesel, kerosene, or any other usable product. Abaddon's Unit 2 distillation column was a total loss. The desalting plant was a total loss. The storage tank would burn for another 9 days before it consumed all available fuel. Repair estimates for Abaddon ranged from $2.1 billion to $3.6 billion depending on which engineering assessment you trusted. Timeline, 18 months to 3 years.
4 missiles had hit Abaddon.
3 of them found their targets. Total missile cost, approximately $4.8 million. The damage they inflicted would cost at least $2 billion to repair and remove billions more in refining capacity from the market for years. The cost ratio was not lost on analysts. $1 million of Israeli munitions had purchased roughly $400 million of Iranian economic damage. That ratio would appear in every defense procurement brief for the next decade. On global markets, the picture was equally dramatic. By 8 a.m. London time, Brent crude had reached $134 per barrel. By noon, it touched $141 before settling back to $136 on reports that the strait remained open. The strait remaining open was the only thing preventing a complete market panic. If those 6 mines had been triggered, if even one supertanker had been hit, the model showed oil reaching $200 within 48 hours and $250 within a week. The global economic impact of a sustained strait closure was estimated at $4 trillion annualized. The mines that prevented that scenario had cost approximately $12 million to manufacture and deploy. The neutralization vehicles, submarine drones, sonobuoys, and operational costs to clear them exceeded $200 million. A $12 million investment had required a $200 million response. That ratio also appeared in the procurement briefs. In Jerusalem, the Israeli cabinet met in an emergency session that lasted 3 hours. The strikes were described as a limited defensive operation targeting Iran's ability to fund hostile activities against Israel. The phrase economic heart was not used by any Israeli official. It didn't need to be. Every headline in the world was already using it. The cabinet authorized continued intelligence operations but no additional strikes. The message had been delivered. It was a very expensive message, delivered very precisely, to a very specific set of targets chosen not for their military significance but for their economic irreplaceability. Israel had not touched a single military base, a single air defense site, a single government building. It had hit the money. Everything else flows from money. In Washington, the president held a brief press availability at 8 a.m. Eastern. He confirmed that U.S. forces had conducted freedom of navigation operations in the Strait of Hormuz. He did not mention mines. He did not mention the Shari Cord. He did not mention underwater drones or explosive ordnance disposal teams cutting anchor chains in the dark. He said that the strait was open, that it would remain open, and that any entity attempting to close it would face consequences. When asked about the Israeli strikes, he said that Israel had the right to defend itself and that the United States had not participated in offensive operations. Both statements were technically accurate. The mine clearance was classified as a defensive operation. The electronic warfare aircraft were Israeli, not American. The distinction between participating and coordinating was apparently a matter of interpretation. Beijing's response came at 11 a.m. Beijing time, roughly 12 hours after the first strike. It was unusually blunt by Chinese diplomatic standards. The foreign ministry spokesman described the strikes as reckless and destabilizing and called for all parties to exercise restraint. The interesting word was not reckless.
It was all parties.
China was not singling out Israel. It was warning Iran as well.
Don't close the strait.
We need that oil more than you need revenge. The ambassador in Tehran was finally put through to the foreign minister. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. Its contents were not disclosed, but Iran's state media coverage of the crisis shifted notably afterward. The language about retaliation became less specific. The timelines became vaguer. Some things translate the same in every language. One of them is don't do anything stupid. 72 hours after the strikes, a preliminary damage assessment compiled by commercial satellite analytics firms estimated the total economic impact as follows. Direct infrastructure damage to Karg Island and Abaddon, $3.50 to $5 billion. Lost oil revenue for Iran over the following 12 months, $18 to $24 billion. Increased global oil costs attributable to the supply disruption, approximately $400 billion annualized, distributed across every oil-importing economy on the planet. Cost of the Israeli munitions used in the strikes, approximately $17 million. Cost of the American mine clearance operation, approximately $200 million. Cost of the mines themselves, approximately $12 million. The most expensive single item destroyed in the entire operation was a crude oil storage tank at Abadan that had been built in 1963. Its replacement cost was estimated at $180 million. The missile that destroyed it cost $1.2 million. The missile that missed its target and hit a maintenance road cost the same $1.2 million. It destroyed approximately $40,000 worth of asphalt. 6 weeks later, the Shari Cord was quietly towed to a shipyard in Bandar Abbas. An inspection of its engine room found nothing wrong with its engines. Both main propulsion diesel engines were fully functional. The engine room failure had been simulated by the crew on orders from IRGC Navy Command. The crew had not been told why. They had been told to fake a breakdown at specific coordinates and deploy their anchor. They did what they were told. They spent 11 hours sitting on top of a weapon that could have killed every person on their ship if something had gone wrong. They were not told about the mine. The IRGC Navy did not consider this relevant to their assignment. The captain of the Shari Cord resigned from the Iranian merchant marine within a month. He did not give a public reason. People who knew him said he had developed a persistent fear of deep water. Nobody else resigned. The oil kept burning. The prices kept climbing. And in shipping offices from Singapore to Rotterdam to Houston, insurance underwriters quietly added a new surcharge to every policy covering Persian Gulf transits. The surcharge was 17%. Nobody argued about it. When the math is that clear, nobody needs to. If you enjoyed this video, check out our other video on how Iran's mine warfare strategy nearly shut down the Persian Gulf in 1988. Bye for now. At 0342 local time, a Tomahawk Block V cruise missile crossed the Iranian coastline at 550 miles per hour, 50 feet above the salt flats south of Bandar Abbas. It was the first of 47 launched from the USS Gettysburg, a Ticonderoga-class cruiser positioned 340 nautical miles southwest in the Gulf of Oman. The missile's terrain-following radar painted the ground ahead like a blind man reading Braille at highway speed, adjusting altitude 40 times per second to hug the earth beneath Iranian air defense coverage. The Tomahawk costs $2.1 million. The target it was aimed at, a hardened aircraft shelter at Bandar Abbas Air Base, cost Iran $180,000 to build in 1987. The math would have been funny if 12 more weren't already in the air behind it. What the cruise missile didn't know, what the mission planners aboard the Gettysburg couldn't have known, was that the shelter had been empty for 9 days. The Su-35 that was supposed to be inside had been towed to a dispersal site 14 kilometers north, parked under camouflage netting between 2 apartment buildings in a residential district. The Iranians had stopped trusting their hardened shelters the day American satellites started counting shadows. The Tomahawk flew for another 23 minutes. It threaded a valley between 2 mountain ridges, popped up to 200 feet to clear a communications tower, dropped back down, and detonated against 4 feet of reinforced concrete protecting absolutely nothing. Somewhere in Bandar Abbas, an IRGC logistics officer was probably already drafting the press release about intercepting an American cruise missile. 120 nautical miles to the north, over the Strait of Hormuz, the real problem was just getting started. An E-2D Advanced Hawkeye, call sign Overwatch, orbited at 25,000 feet with its APY-9 radar spinning lazy circles above the water. The APY-9 can track over 2,000 targets simultaneously out to 350 nautical miles. It sees everything from fishing boats to ballistic missiles and sorts them into categories the way a bouncer sorts a club line: harmless, watch closely, or call the cops. Right now it was watching something that didn't fit any category. A surface contact, radar cross-section consistent with a small fishing vessel, had been tracking northeast at 8 knots for the past 6 hours. Normal behavior for the hundreds of dhows that work these waters. Except this one had stopped 40 minutes ago. And now it was accelerating. 15 knots. 25, 40. The operator keyed his radio. Overwatch to sentry flight. Surface contact bearing 047, range 85, speed now indicating 45 knots. Classify fast attack. 45 knots from a dhow was impossible. 45 knots from a small combatant was Tuesday in the Persian Gulf. 80 nautical miles southeast. 2F divided by a -18E Super Hornets from VFA 143, the Pukin dogs, were already turning toward the contact. They had been flying combat air patrol since 0200 bored, caffeinated, and hoping something would happen. Something was happening. Sentry Lee descended through 15,000 feet and put his APG-79 radar, an active electronically scanned array that can switch from air-to-air to air-to-ground modes faster than a pilot can blink, onto the surface. The contact resolved. Small hull, deck-mounted structure, thermal bloom consistent with gas turbine exhaust. Paycap-class fast attack craft, Iranian Revolutionary Guard Navy, 76 feet long, armed with 2 Chinese C-701 anti-ship missiles, capable of 52 knots in calm water. The ARGC had 14 of them scattered across the Gulf, and they used them the way insurgents use car bombs. cheap, fast, expendable, and absolutely capable of ruining someone's day. The pay cap wasn't alone. As Sentry Lead watched, 2 more thermal signatures emerged from behind a rocky outcrop on the Iranian coast. Then 2 more. 5 fast attack craft accelerating toward the Gettysburg's last known position in a spread formation designed to overwhelm point defense systems with simultaneous attacks from multiple vectors. What the pay cap commanders didn't know was that the Gettysburg wasn't where they thought it was. The cruiser had displaced 30 nautical miles west 4 hours ago, standard operating procedure after a Tomahawk launch to avoid exactly this kind of retaliation. The Iranians were charging toward a patch of empty ocean where an American warship had been yesterday. But 30 nautical miles west put the Gettysburg directly in line with something else. The USNS Rappahannock, a fleet replenishment oiler, currently transferring 400,000 gallons of JP-5 aviation fuel to the USS Bataan, an amphibious assault ship carrying 1,800 Marines and the aviation assets to support them. 2 ships connected by fuel lines, dead in the water, 95 nautical miles from 5 inbound missiles on hulls. The geometry was about to get very personal. Overwatch plotted the intercept. At current speeds, the pay cap formation would reach the replenishment group in 47 minutes. The Gettysburg could engage with SM-6 missiles at 130 nautical miles. The Super Hornets could engage with Harpoons at 70. The problem wasn't range. The problem was identification. Rules of engagement required positive identification before weapons release. A pay cap looked exactly like a civilian speedboat on radar until it launched a missile or opened fire. The C-701 had a range of 15 nautical miles. A pay cap could close to launch range, fire, and be turning away before a pilot confirmed it was military. And the Strait of Hormuz at any given moment contained somewhere between 200 and 400 civilian vessels that looked exactly the same size on radar. Sentry Lead descended to 8,000 feet and slaved his targeting pod to the lead contact. The Fleur, a camera system that can read a license plate from 10 miles away in daylight, showed a gray hull, no flag, deck-mounted launcher that could have been a missile rail or a fishing net crane. He needed closer. 5 miles from the contact, doing 400 knots, Sentry Lead rolled wings level and let the Fleur build a picture. 2 tubes angled forward on the bow. Definitely military. Definitely armed. He keyed the radio. Sentry Lead, Overwatch, Tally Hostile, pay cap class, weapons visible, requesting clearance to engage. The response took 11 seconds. In those 11 seconds, the formation covered another half-mile toward the replenishment group. Sentry Flight, Overwatch, cleared to engage, weapons free on hostile surface contacts. The lead Hornet was carrying 2 AGM-84D Harpoon anti-ship missiles. The Harpoon costs $1.4 million, flies at 530 miles per hour, carries a 488-pound warhead, and was designed during the Cold War to sink Soviet cruisers. Using it on a 76-foot patrol boat was like hunting rabbits with a howitzer. Effective? Certainly. Cost-efficient? Absolutely not. Sentry Lead pickled the first Harpoon at 18 nautical miles. The missile dropped from the centerline station, turbofan ignited, and accelerated toward the sea surface while its radar seeker searched for the largest metal object in its field of view. The pay cap's radar warning receiver screamed. At 52 knots, the patrol boat commander had roughly 90 seconds to decide between evasion and acceptance. He chose evasion. Hard turn to port, chaff blooming behind the boat like metallic confetti, a maneuver that might have worked against an older missile. The Harpoon's seeker wasn't fooled. It ignored the chaff cloud, adjusted course 3 degrees, and impacted the pay cap's stern at 530 miles per hour. A 488-pound warhead against a 76-foot hull is less a naval engagement than a magic trick. The boat was there, then it wasn't. Fire, debris, and 6 crew members scattered across a quarter-mile of water. 4 pay caps remaining. 42 minutes to the replenishment group. What the American pilots didn't know was that the pay cap attack was a diversion. The real threat was already inside the engagement envelope, and it had been there for 3 hours. A Goddard-class midget submarine, 29 meters long, diesel-electric, virtually silent at creep speed, had been loitering 8 nautical miles southwest of the replenishment group's current position since before dawn. The Goddard was designed for exactly this mission: shallow water ambush in the crowded shipping lanes of the Gulf, where thermal layers and biological noise made submarine detection a nightmare. The Goddard carried 2 heavyweight torpedoes. Either one could break a ship's back, both could sink an oiler full of aviation fuel and the 400 men aboard it. Aboard the Rappahannock, the unrep was 60% complete. Fuel hoses stretched between the 2 ships like umbilical cords, JP-5 flowing at 800 gallons per minute. The ships moved at 12 knots, slow enough to maintain the connection, fast enough to keep steerage way. Neither captain knew what was 8 miles behind them. The Goddard commander had been watching through his periscope for 20 minutes, building a firing solution on the larger of the 2 contacts. The torpedo run would take 4 minutes at high speed. Once he fired, the Americans would know exactly where he was. He would have perhaps 90 seconds before every sonobuoy and dipping sonar in the Gulf converged on his position.
One shot, maybe two.
Then run for shallow water and pray.
He flooded the tubes.
30,000 feet above, an MQ-4C Triton, the Navy's high-altitude surveillance drone, detected something that shouldn't have existed. A momentary thermal anomaly on the water surface, 8 nautical miles from the replenishment group, consistent with a submarine's diesel exhaust venting. The Ghadar had snorkeled 6 hours ago to recharge batteries. The Triton's multispectral sensors caught the residual heat signature where the exhaust had warmed the surface water. The algorithm flagged it. A human analyst in a ground station 7,000 miles away looked at the flag, cross-referenced it with acoustic data from a distributed sonobuoy field, and made a phone call. Overwatch received the flash traffic 47 seconds later. The E-2D operator stared at his screen. The submarine contact was behind the replenishment group, inside minimum torpedo range, positioned for an ambush shot on the oiler's vulnerable stern. The paycaps charging from the northeast weren't the attack. They were the distraction, forcing American assets to focus north while the real threat crept in from the south.
2 problems.
1 airframe available to solve them. An MH-60R Seahawk, call sign Hunter 21, was orbiting 15 nautical miles east of the replenishment group, originally tasked with surface search along the shipping lanes. The Seahawk carried 2 Mk-54 lightweight torpedoes, a dipping sonar, and a crew of 4 who were about to have a very busy morning. Hunter 21, Overwatch, Retask immediate, subsurface contact bearing 195 from Hotel Alpha, range 8, classify hostile, cleared hot. The pilot banked hard, dropped the nose, and started toward the contact at 140 knots. The tactical coordinator in the back began programming the sonar, while the sensor operator readied a torpedo. They had maybe 6 minutes before the Ghadar was in optimal firing position.
Maybe less.
40 nautical miles north, the remaining paycaps were spreading further apart, each boat now a separate threat axis requiring individual tracking. Sentry 2 engaged the second contact with a harpoon at 15 miles.
Impact.
3 remaining. The Super Hornets were running low on anti-ship missiles. 2 harpoons remaining between them, 3 targets, and the rules of engagement didn't allow gun runs on surface contacts that hadn't fired first. The math wasn't working. Overwatch made a call. Sentry flight, break off surface engagement, redirect to subsurface prosecution support. The paycaps would have to be someone else's problem. The submarine was 6 minutes from a firing solution on an oiler carrying enough fuel to burn for a week. Hunter 21 arrived over the datum point and deployed the dipping sonar. The AQS-22 dropped into the water on 200 feet of cable, its transducer pinging active pulses into the thermocline while passive arrays listened for engine noise, prop cavitation, anything that sounded like a submarine instead of a shrimp bed. Contact. Bearing 210, range 2,400 yards, depth 80 feet, moving slowly northeast. The Ghadar commander heard the dipping sonar the moment it went active. He had roughly 30 seconds before the helicopter prosecuted. He could fire now, accept the counterattack, and hope the torpedo reached its target before his boat was destroyed. Or he could go deep, run silent, and try to escape into the acoustic clutter of the shipping lanes. He fired both torpedoes. The acoustic signature of a torpedo launch is unmistakable. 2 distinct splashes, followed by the high-frequency whine of contra-rotating propellers accelerating toward 45 knots. The Seahawk crew heard it instantly. Hunter 21, torpedo in the water, 2 fish, bearing 030, speed 45, depth 40 feet. The sensor operator dropped a Mk-54 on the submarine's position, while the pilot keyed the guard frequency to warn the replenishment group. The torpedo entered the water, acquired the Ghadar screw noise, and started its terminal run. 4 miles north, aboard the Rappahannock, alarm sounded. Emergency breakaway. The fuel hoses disconnected automatically, valves slamming shut to prevent spills, while both ships went to flank speed and diverged. A replenishment ship emergency breakaway takes approximately 2 minutes. The incoming torpedoes would cover 4 miles in 5 minutes. The math was close. The Batan's SLQ-32 electronic warfare suite detected the torpedo seekers and began jamming, filling the water with acoustic noise designed to confuse the guidance systems. The Rappahannock had no such system. It had a hull full of aviation fuel and a top speed of 20 knots. The first torpedo tracked straight for the oiler's wake. Torpedo seekers home on the acoustic disturbance a ship's propellers leave in the water, a trail of turbulence and cavitation bubbles that points directly at the target like an arrow. The Rappahannock was making 20 knots, generating exactly the kind of wake a torpedo loves. 900 yards out, the torpedo's seeker locked onto the bubble trail and accelerated for terminal attack. The Batan launched a Nixie torpedo decoy, a towed noisemaker designed to sound more like a ship than the ship itself. It pulled away from the formation at 25 knots, trailing 500 yards behind the Batan's stern, screaming acoustic energy into the water like a drunk at a concert. The second torpedo, the one tracking the Batan, diverted. It abandoned the warship's wake and chased the Nixie, detonating 200 yards behind the decoy in an explosion that sent a geyser of water 100 feet into the air. The concussion rattled windows aboard the Batan but caused no damage. The first torpedo didn't have a decoy to chase. The Rappahannock didn't carry Nixie. It carried fuel. 400 yards. 300. The Seahawk's Mk-54 impacted the Goddard at the same moment. The midget submarine, running shallow to escape, took a 96-pound warhead through its pressure hull. The explosion broke the boat in half. Both sections sank in water too shallow to hide them, 200 feet down, visible on sonar as two distinct debris fields. 29 Iranian sailors died without ever knowing if their torpedoes hit. They didn't. At 150 yards, the Iranian torpedo's guidance system suffered a failure that the after-action report would later attribute to thermal gradients near the surface. The weapon passed 40 yards ahead of the Rappahannock's bow, continued northeast for another mile, exhausted its fuel, and sank. The oiler's captain was about to need new underwear. Everyone aboard the Rappahannock was about to need a drink. But 400,000 gallons of aviation fuel continued floating on the surface of the Gulf, unburned, because a torpedo seeker hiccuped at the wrong moment. Luck is not a military strategy, but it is occasionally a military outcome. 70 nautical miles to the north, the remaining 3 paycaps had closed to within 25 nautical miles of where they thought the Gettysburg was. They were still charging toward empty ocean. The Gettysburg, now fully aware of the threat, had launched 2 SM-6 missiles at the closest contact. The SM-6 is a different animal than the Harpoon. It costs $4.3 million, flies at Mach 3.5, and was designed to intercept aircraft and cruise missiles at extreme range. Using it against a patrol boat was like swatting a mosquito with a sledgehammer. But the sledgehammer was available and the mosquito was 25 miles away and carrying anti-ship missiles. The first SM-6 impacted the third paycap in a vertical dive from 70,000 feet, converting the boat into scattered debris before the crew knew they'd been targeted. A $4.3 million missile against a $3 million patrol boat. The economics were almost reasonable, if you squinted. 2 paycaps remaining. Both had watched their formation mates disappear and decided discretion was the better part of martyrdom. They turned, went to maximum speed, and ran for Iranian territorial waters. The Gettysburg could have pursued. The ROE allowed engagement of hostile forces attempting to flee. But 2 patrol boats running home at 52 knots weren't a threat anymore. They were a message. Iran had just lost a submarine, 4 fast attack craft, and approximately 80 personnel in under 30 minutes. The Americans had lost nothing but missiles and fuel. The exchange rate was what defense analysts would later call unsustainable. 400 nautical miles to the west, in a bunker complex outside Natanz, an IRGC general was receiving real-time reports of the disaster. The paycap attack had been his plan. The submarine ambush had been his innovation. Both had failed completely, killed everyone involved, and destroyed assets that would take years to replace. He looked at the map on his wall, the blue symbols marking American carrier positions, the red symbols marking Iranian assets that no longer existed, and began drafting a message to Tehran. The message recommended immediate cessation of naval operations in the Gulf. The message noted that American anti-submarine capabilities had proven significantly more effective than intelligence assessments predicted. The message did not mention that the general had been the one who wrote those assessments. 3 days later, the Iranian Navy pulled every remaining Goddard submarine back to port. The paycap fleet, now reduced by a third, was ordered to cease operations in international waters. The Strait of Hormuz remained open. Oil continued flowing to Asia and Europe at the rate of 21 million barrels per day. The entire engagement, from the first Tomahawk launch to the last paycap fleeing for Iranian waters, had lasted 3 hours and 47 minutes. It had cost Iran 1 submarine, 4 patrol boats, and any illusion that harassment tactics in the Gulf would go unpunished. It had cost the United States approximately $18 million in missiles spent on targets worth perhaps a tenth of that value. Defense contractors in Tucson and St. Louis were probably already scheduling celebratory lunches. Aboard the Rappahannock, the crew secured from general quarters and resumed replenishment operations with the Batan. The fuel transfer that had been interrupted by torpedo attack completed 4 hours later without further incident. The oiler's deck log noted the event in the understated language the Navy reserves for near-death experiences. 0347 emergency breakaway due to hostile subsurface activity. 0351 torpedo passed ahead at close range. 0815 resumed unrep. The Batan's Marines, most of whom had slept through the entire engagement in berthing compartments below the waterline, woke up to rumors about torpedoes and submarines and decided the Navy types were probably exaggerating. The Navy types decided not to correct them. Hunter 2-1 recovered aboard the Bataan with empty torpedo tubes and a crew that would be telling this story for the rest of their careers. The sensor operator who called the submarine contact would receive a Navy Achievement Medal 6 months later. The citation would note his quick reaction to developing tactical situation, without mentioning that developing tactical situation was Pentagon speak for almost got an oiler blown up. The Triton drone that detected the submarine's thermal signature continued orbiting at 55,000 feet, its cameras and sensors sweeping the Gulf with the patience of a machine that doesn't get bored, doesn't get tired, and costs $180 million to build. The algorithm that flagged the thermal anomaly would be updated the following week to improve detection of diesel submarine exhaust patterns. A programmer in San Diego added 6 lines of code and went to lunch. Somewhere in the Gulf, an Iranian rescue vessel searched for survivors from the Ghadir. They found debris, an oil slick, and no one alive. The submarine had been one of 23 in Iran's midget submarine fleet, vessels specifically designed for operations in the shallow, cluttered waters of the Gulf. 22 remained. But the commanders of those 22 now knew exactly what would happen if they tried the same tactic again. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 nautical miles wide at its narrowest point. Roughly 20% of the world's oil passes through it every day. For 3 hours and 47 minutes on a Tuesday morning, control of that passage was genuinely contested. Then it wasn't. If you enjoyed this video, check out our other video on the F-35's electronic warfare capabilities that helped shape the air battle over Iran. Bye for now. At 4:12 local time, 2 Khalid-Fars anti-ship ballistic missiles leave their transporter erector launchers from a ridgeline above Bandar Abbas and accelerate through the pre-dawn darkness over the Strait of Hormuz. Their target is 120 kilometers to the south, moving at 18 knots through international waters. It weighs 104,000 tons. It carries 90 aircraft, and it has no idea that the next 6 minutes are about to rewrite every assumption the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has held about what it means to strike an American aircraft carrier. The USS Abraham Lincoln, CVN-72, is the 4th Nimitz-class carrier to rotate through the 5th Fleet area of operations this year. Her flight deck stretches 1,092 feet. Her 4 catapults can throw a 50,000-pound aircraft from 0 to 165 miles per hour in under 3 seconds. Her air wing, Carrier Air Wing 7, includes 44F divided by a -18E and F Super Hornets, 5EA, 18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft, and an assortment of helicopters and surveillance platforms that give her the ability to see, jam, and kill anything within a 500 nautical mile radius. She costs $8.5 billion. The 2 missiles heading toward her cost $3 million combined. Somebody in Tehran looked at that math and thought it was a bargain. The strike group surrounding the Lincoln is not a single ship. It is a floating fortress spread across 40 nautical miles of dark water. The guided missile destroyers USS Carney and USS Nitsa, both Arleigh Burke-class flight IIA ships, carry a combined 192 vertical launch cells. Between them, those cells hold SM-6 interceptors capable of engaging targets from sea level to the edge of space, SM-2 Block IIC area defense missiles, Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles, and Evolved Sea Sparrow point defense rounds. Beneath the surface, 300 meters down in the warm waters of the Gulf of Oman, the Los Angeles-class attack submarine USS Cheyenne tracks every Iranian vessel within 60 kilometers using her BQQ-10 sonar suite while carrying 12 Tomahawk cruise missiles in her torpedo tubes, each one programmed with coordinates that were last updated 4 hours ago. This is the most capable naval formation on Earth. And in the mountains above Bandar Abbas, the IRGC Aerospace Force battery commander who just launched those 2 ballistic missiles believes he has found its weakness. He is not entirely wrong. 130 kilometers north of the Lincoln, along 3 separate stretches of Iranian coastline, 12 Shahed 238 jet-powered attack drones ignite their turbojet engines 40 seconds after the ballistic missiles launch. These are not the lumbering Shahed 136 one-way attack drones that became famous over Ukraine, the ones that sound like lawnmowers and fly at 115 miles per hour. The Shahed 238 is a different animal entirely. Turbojet-powered, radar-guided, capable of Mach 0.8, roughly 600 miles per hour at wave-top altitude. They cross the radar horizon with less than 90 seconds of warning time. Each one costs approximately $50,000. All 12 together cost less than a single SM-6 interceptor, which runs the United States Navy $4.3 million per round. Every missile fired to stop a $50,000 drone is a financial victory for Tehran before a single warhead detonates. The Lincoln Spy-6 radar, the most advanced naval search radar ever deployed, detects the 2 ballistic missiles at a range of 270 kilometers. The system classifies the threat, computes an intercept solution, and passes it to the Aegis Combat System aboard USS Carney in under 2 seconds. The alarm sounds across every ship in the strike group simultaneously. Battle stations. The entire carrier defense architecture shifts to full engagement posture in 11 seconds. Sailors who were asleep 15 seconds ago are running to their stations in the dark, pulling on flash gear, strapping into chairs. USS Carney fires two SM-6 interceptors at the lead ballistic missile. The SM-6 is a 3,300-pound missile that accelerates to Mach 3.5, roughly 2,700 miles per hour, and can engage targets at ranges exceeding 150 nautical miles. Think of a telephone pole that steers itself through the atmosphere using an active radar seeker in its nose, hunting its target the way a flashlight finds a face in a dark room. The first SM-6 finds the lead CIWS cleanly. Intercept at 60 kilometers. The ballistic missile disintegrates. Debris rains into black water that nobody will ever search. The second ballistic missile is the problem. It executes a terminal maneuver, a pre-programmed we've designed to defeat the predictive algorithms that guide American interceptors during the final phase of engagement. Two SM-6 missiles chase it. The first loses tracking during the maneuver and self-destructs. The second detonates close enough to shred the seeker head and damage the guidance fins, but the warhead survives. The missile transitions from a guided weapon to a 1,500-pound piece of debris falling along a degraded ballistic arc, and that arc intersects the flight deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln. At 4:16 local time, 4 minutes and 44 seconds after launch, the damaged CIWS strikes the Lincoln's flight deck at an angle, punches through the armored steel plating, and detonates inside the hangar bay. The warhead is a unitary high-explosive penetrator. The fireball reaches 60 feet. 3F divided by a -18E Super Hornets parked in the hangar bay are destroyed instantly. Shrapnel tears through bulkheads. The concussion wave throws sailors against walls, into equipment, onto the deck. 9 American sailors in the hangar bay die in the first second. 27 more are wounded by blast, burns, and fragmentation. The flight deck buckles across a 40-meter section. The number 3 catapult is offline. Fire suppression systems activate automatically, but the hangar bay fire has already found aircraft fuel, and the drones are 30 seconds out. What the IRGC planners understood, what made their attack architecture genuinely brilliant, was sequencing. The ballistic missiles were never meant to sink the Lincoln. They were meant to saturate the Aegis engagement timeline at exactly the moment the low-altitude drone swarm crossed the radar horizon. Every SM-6 fired upward at a ballistic missile is an SM-6 that cannot be fired laterally at a sea-skimming drone. Every second the fire control system spends computing a ballistic intercept solution is a second it is not tracking the wave-top threats approaching from 3 different azimuths. It is the right idea. It has been the right idea in every simulation the IRGC has run for the past decade. And in this moment, it is working. 12 Shahed 238 drones cross the radar horizon at 18 kilometers. The Aegis systems aboard Carney and Nitsa detect them, but the engagement windows are compressed. 7 drones are intercepted, 5 by SM-2 missiles, 2 by the Phalanx CIWS close-in weapon systems, the automated 20mm Gatling guns that serve as the final layer of defense. Each Phalanx fires 75 rounds per second, throwing a wall of tungsten into the path of an incoming threat at a range of less than 2 kilometers. 5 drones penetrate. 2 strike the Lincoln's Island superstructure, the command tower rising above the flight deck. 1 hits the forward flight deck near the damaged section, compounding the structural failure. 2 hit USS Nitsa. Her bridge is destroyed. Her commanding officer, executive officer, and 6 watchstanders are killed instantly. 8 more American sailors dead. At 4:17 local time, 5 minutes into the attack, the toll stands at 17 American sailors killed and 62 wounded across 2 ships. The Lincoln's flight deck is burning. Nitsa is combat effective from her secondary control station, but her command structure has been decapitated. Carney is undamaged but has expended 23 SM-6 interceptors, each one worth $4.3 million. The math so far: Iran spent roughly $6.6 million in weapons. The interceptors alone cost $98.9 million. Tehran's procurement office could call that a win even if every weapon missed. What the IRGC battery commander did not know, what his intelligence officers could not have told him, what no Iranian signals intercept or Russian satellite feed had ever revealed, was that the response to his attack had been planned, authorized, armed, and loaded into launch systems 11 months before he pressed the fire button. Operation Granite Hammer. Classified contingency strike package, submitted by United States Central Command to the Secretary of Defense following 14 months of escalating IRGC harassment of American carrier groups in the Strait of Hormuz. The package identified 41 Iranian military targets within 350 kilometers of the strait. Every radar site, missile battery, command node, fuel depot, weapons storage facility, drone launch platform, and naval base that contributes to Iran's ability to threaten carrier operations in the Hormuz transit corridor. Each target was assigned to a specific platform. Each platform was assigned specific weapons. Flight routes were deconflicted. Time on target calculations ensured simultaneous impact across all 41 targets. and the Secretary of Defense signed pre-delegated launch authority. No White House phone call. No National Security Council meeting. No congressional notification before execution. The trigger condition was simple. Confirmed hostile fire from Iranian territory resulting in American casualties aboard a United States warship. Iran satisfied that condition at 4:16 local time. The execution order reaches 5 platforms simultaneously at 4:18, 2 minutes after the Lincoln took her first hit. 180 nautical miles to the southeast, in the deep water of the Gulf of Oman, the USS Florida surfaces to launch depth. Florida is not a regular submarine. She is an Ohio-class guided missile submarine, originally built as a ballistic missile boat, converted to carry 154 Tomahawk cruise missiles in 22 vertical launch tubes. She is the most heavily armed conventional strike platform in the United States Navy. Her crew has been at modified battle stations for 9 days, waiting for a message exactly like the one that just arrived. Beneath the strike group, USS Cheyenne acknowledges her portion of the strike package. Her 12 Tomahawks are already warm. 2,100 nautical miles to the south, over the central Arabian Sea, 2 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers from the 509th Bomb Wing, operating out of Diego Garcia, have been holding in a racetrack orbit for 6 hours. Each carries 16 GBU, 57 massive ordnance penetrators, bunker-busting bombs weighing 30,000 pounds each, designed to penetrate 200 feet of reinforced concrete before detonating. They were built for exactly 3 categories of targets on Earth: North Korean tunnels, Iranian mountain bunkers, and Chinese underground facilities. Today they have Iranian addresses. Aboard USS Carney, despite the chaos of the past 5 minutes, the weapons officer executes her assigned launch sequence. Her vertical launch cells still function. Tomahawks begin rising from the forward deck. And on the Lincoln herself, even as damage control teams fight the hangar bay fire, 12F divided by a -18E Super Hornets from Strike Fighter Squadron 86 that were already airborne on combat air patrol receive updated targeting packages. Each aircraft carries 2 AGM-158C long-range anti-ship missiles reconfigured for land attack, known as JSSMER, the Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missile Extended Range. Range: 575 miles. They can release from outside Iranian radar coverage, turn around, and land back on an Allied airfield without ever crossing into Iranian airspace. From authorization to last weapon away, 6 minutes and 11 seconds. Total precision-guided munitions converging on Iranian territory, 148. 41 targets. Simultaneous time on target impact calculated to the second. The largest coordinated naval strike since Operation Desert Storm, assembled from assets that were pre-positioned, pre-loaded, and waiting for exactly this morning. Somewhere in a Raytheon boardroom, the next quarterly earnings call just wrote itself. First impacts begin at 4:27 local time, 11 minutes after the Lincoln took her hit. Bandar Abbas Integrated Missile Command Center. This is the brain. The facility that coordinated the morning's attack sits under 3 meters of reinforced concrete, hardened against conventional cruise missile strikes, considered survivable against anything short of a nuclear weapon. 2 GBU, 57 massive ordnance penetrators arrive 0.4 seconds apart. The first punches through the roof and buries itself in the operations level. The second follows through the entry hole and detonates at a depth of 40 feet. 30,000 pounds of guided American steel moving at 700 miles per hour does not care about reinforced concrete. The command center collapses into itself. Every officer who planned and executed the morning's carrier strike dies in the same detonation. Their screens are still showing the damage assessment of the Lincoln when the ceiling becomes the floor. 90 kilometers east, at Bandar Jask, the Khalij Fars battery that launched the 2 missiles at the Lincoln this morning is still repositioning its transporter erector launchers for a second salvo. The battery commander has been on the radio for 6 minutes trying to confirm the Lincoln's damage. He wants to fire again. 8 Tomahawks arrive before he gets his answer. The launch vehicles explode on their transports. The reload trucks, parked 200 meters behind the ridgeline in what the battery crew believed was a concealed position, cook off simultaneously. The fuel depot ignites. Secondary explosions continue for 9 minutes. Every piece of equipment and every crew member associated with the morning's ballistic launch ceases to exist. Iran's carrier killer battery program just became a $400 million debris field. 200 kilometers to the west, Kish Island Air Defense Radar Complex. This is the installation that provided the Lincoln's coordinates to the missile battery. Without its long-range phased array radar feeding targeting data in real time, the ballistic strike could not have been coordinated. 12 Tomahawks are allocated. The phased array antenna, a structure the size of a 3-story building, disappears in the first 4 impacts. The command building takes 3 direct hits through its roof. Backup generators, communication towers, the vehicle park, all destroyed within 40 seconds. Iranian maritime surveillance across a 200-kilometer sector of the strait goes permanently dark. The operators who spent 9 hours tracking the Lincoln and feeding her position to the missile crews have the same amount of warning time their targets did.
Which is to say, none.
Keshem Island IRGC Naval Base. Iran's forward operating position for fast attack boat operations in the strait. 47 missile-armed speedboats are tied to their moorings. Each boat carries 2 C-802 anti-ship missiles, a Chinese-derived weapon with a range of 120 kilometers. In IRGC doctrine, these boats would swarm an American warship in coordinated waves, overwhelming point defenses with sheer numbers. 8 Tomahawks hit the pier complex. Boats explode at their berths as their missile magazines detonate. The fuel farm ignites into a column of fire visible from 60 kilometers. The barracks, the maintenance shops, the base commander's headquarters, systematically destroyed in a 90-second window. 47 boats that were supposed to be Iran's insurance policy against American naval power burn at the waterline. It turns out the swarm doctrine works better when the swarm survives to launch. Shahid Bayhoner Naval Base. Iran's primary IRGC naval headquarters for Strait of Hormuz operations.
18 Tomahawks.
The 4-story headquarters building, the operational brain of Iran's entire Hormuz defense strategy, receives 4 cruise missiles through its facade in a 2-second sequence. The building pancakes. The operations center that was monitoring the Lincoln's damage and drafting follow-up strike orders is buried under 20 meters of concrete. The weapons storage facility takes 3 hits. Stored NOR anti-ship missiles detonate in a chain reaction that destroys 4 adjacent structures and starts fires that will burn for 2 days. The 3 coastal drone launch positions from which the morning's 12 Shahid 238s were released each receive 6 Tomahawks. Mobile launchers, support vehicles, propellant storage, communications relays. Systematically erased across all 3 sites in a 4-minute window. 14 additional targets, radar nodes, communications relays, ammunition depots, hardened command bunkers scattered across a 300-kilometer coastal arc, received the remaining weapons. Total strike duration from first impact to last detonation, 4 minutes and 52 seconds. At 4:32 local time, 20 minutes after the attack on the Lincoln began, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' entire integrated anti-ship and anti-carrier strike network along the Strait of Hormuz, a system that took 30 years and an estimated $40 billion to construct, exists only as satellite imagery of burning wreckage. The infrastructure is not damaged. It is not degraded.
It is gone.
And it was gone before the fires on the Lincoln's flight deck were contained. The exchange, calculated with the cold precision that defense analysts prefer. Iran fired 14 weapons. America returned 148. Iran killed 17 American sailors. An estimated 670 Iranian Revolutionary Guard personnel died across 41 facilities. Iran damaged 1 carrier and 1 destroyer, both reparable. America destroyed 41 installations, none rebuildable under current sanctions in any timeline that matters. Iran spent $6.6 million in munitions. The American response cost approximately $320 million in weapons expenditure, roughly the cost of 3 days of carrier operations in the 5th Fleet area of responsibility. Iran traded 30 years of military infrastructure for 6 minutes of footage showing smoke rising from an American flight deck. That footage will play on Iranian state television for decades. But the satellite images of 41 burning facilities will play in every IRGC planning room for longer. The diplomatic aftermath unfolds with mechanical predictability. Iran's foreign ministry claims the Lincoln violated an Iranian maritime exclusion zone, a zone that does not exist under international law and has never been recognized by any nation including Iran's own allies. The United States releases full radar tracks proving the Lincoln's position in international waters, communications intercepts confirming attack authorization from IRGC headquarters, and satellite imagery of every destroyed facility. The evidence package reaches the United Nations, NATO, and every Gulf capital within 3 hours. Saudi Arabia calls the Iranian attack unprovoked aggression. The UAE offers expanded port access for American ship repairs. Bahrain reaffirms its defense cooperation agreement. Even Oman, Tehran's traditional back-channel partner, issues a statement expressing deep concern. The regional message is unanimous and clear. Nobody is mourning Iran's missile batteries. The Lincoln returns to Bahrain under her own power. Flight deck repairs are estimated at 11 months. The 17 sailors killed are transported home with full military honors. Their families receive notification before any public statement. They were 21 years old, 23 years old, 34 years old. They had plans they had not yet finished making. and in every IRGC command post from Bandar Abbas to Tehran, the officers who survived the morning of the Lincoln incident now carry one piece of knowledge they did not have 24 hours ago. The American response to a carrier attack is not a decision. It is not a debate. It is not a proportional, calibrated, diplomatically sensitive reply designed for international optics. It is a preloaded, pre-authorized, pre-aimed annihilation package that activates automatically the moment American blood hits an American deck. The officer who gives the launch order does not just order an attack on a carrier. He orders the simultaneous destruction of his own command center, his own radar stations, his own missile batteries, his own naval base, and his own life. He just does not know it yet. Iran found out why Americans do not have free healthcare. If you enjoyed this video, check out our other video on what happens when China's carrier killer missiles meet the USS Gerald Ford's layered defense network. Bye for now. At 2:14 local time, a single Iranian Type 412 naval mine broke free from its anchor chain in the middle of the Strait of Hormuz and drifted 600 feet into the westbound shipping lane. It struck the hull of the MV Coral Meridian, a Maltese-flagged crude carrier loaded with 2 million barrels of Basra heavy. The detonation tore a 40-foot gash below the waterline. Within 9 minutes, crude oil was spreading across the warmest choke point on Earth at a rate of 4,000 gallons per minute. Within 14 minutes, the Coral Meridian was listing 11 degrees to port. Within 20 minutes, every maritime insurance company in London had frozen new policy issuances for the Persian Gulf. And within 1 hour, the price of Brent crude jumped $19. That was Tuesday. By Wednesday, the Strait of Hormuz was closed. Not partially, not restricted, closed. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy had deployed over 300 sea mines across the shipping lanes in a 48-hour sprint, using a combination of fast attack craft, civilian dhows, and at least 4 Ghadar-class midget submarines. They had also activated shore-based anti-ship missile batteries at Keshem Island, Abu Musa, and the Larak coastal garrison. Any vessel attempting transit would face a layered threat combining contact mines, influence mines, cruise missiles, and fastboat swarms. The entire global energy market was being held hostage by roughly 60 miles of water. The stated reason, broadcast on Iranian state television by a spokesman for the Supreme National Security Council, was retaliation for what Tehran called an act of economic warfare. 6 days earlier, the United States had imposed a new round of sanctions targeting Iran's central bank, its sovereign wealth reserves held in Chinese and Emirati financial institutions, and for the first time, secondary sanctions on any port facility worldwide that processed Iranian crude. The effect was immediate and devastating. Iran's remaining oil exports, roughly 1.3 million barrels a day, mostly flowing to China and India through intermediary shell companies, froze overnight. Tankers that had been loading at Karg Island simply stopped. Payment channels collapsed. Tehran estimated losses of $90 million per day. So they closed the strait. And then the message came. At 11 o'clock Washington time on Wednesday morning, the White House released a 4-sentence statement. It did not use diplomatic language. It said that the mining of international waterways constituted an act of war under international maritime law. It said that the United States would guarantee freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. It said that Iran had 48 hours to begin verifiable mine clearance operations and withdraw all anti-ship missile systems to a distance of 50 kilometers from the coastline. And it said that failure to comply would result in the United States and its coalition partners taking all necessary action to reopen the strait. 48 hours. That was the number. Not 72. Not a week. 48. Tehran's public response arrived in under an hour. The Supreme Leader's office issued a statement calling the ultimatum an act of arrogance that would be met with fire. The IRGC Navy commander went on television and said that any American warship entering the strait would be sent to the bottom. Social media accounts linked to the Basij militia began posting coordinates of American bases in the region with targeting overlays. The rhetoric was loud. The rhetoric was expected. But 600 miles to the south, at the Combined Air Operations Center at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, the rhetoric was irrelevant. What mattered was the clock. 48 hours. And the first 12 were already gone. At Al Udeid, the air tasking order for what was being called Operation Bright Horizon was already on its 3rd revision. The problem was not firepower. The United States 5th Fleet, already forward deployed in Bahrain, had been reinforced over the previous 72 hours by the Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group, which had transited the Suez Canal at flank speed, and the America Amphibious Ready Group coming from the Western Indian Ocean. Combined with assets already in theater, the Navy had 2 aircraft carriers, 9 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, 4 Ticonderoga-class cruisers, 3 Virginia-class attack submarines, and a combined air wing of over 140 aircraft. Ashore, the Air Force had F-35A Lightning IIs staged at Al Dhafra in the UAE, F-15E Strike Eagles at Al Udeid, B-1B Lancers rotating through Diego Garcia, and a squadron of F-22A Raptors that had quietly arrived at an undisclosed Gulf State airfield 3 days before the crisis even started. The problem was not firepower. The problem was mines. Sea mines are the most cost-effective weapon in naval warfare. An Iranian EM-52 rising mine costs roughly $10,000 to manufacture. The mine countermeasure vessel needed to find and neutralize it costs $600 million. A single mine can close a shipping lane for days. 300 mines can close it for weeks. And unlike missiles, which can be intercepted, or ships, which can be sunk, mines just sit there, silent, patient, waiting for something heavy to pass overhead. Clearing them requires specialized ships, underwater drones, helicopter-towed sleds, and time. Lots of time. The U.S. Navy's mine countermeasures force in the Gulf consisted of 4 Avenger-class mine countermeasure ships, 8 MH-60R Dragon helicopters, and a handful of unmanned underwater vehicles. Under normal conditions, clearing 300 mines from a waterway the size of the Strait of Hormuz would take 30 to 45 days. They did not have 30 to 45 days. They had 36 hours. 1,200 miles to the west, at Ramstein Air Base in Germany, the airlift was already underway. 2 C-17 Globemaster IIIs loaded with Mk-18 Mod 2 Kingfish unmanned underwater vehicles and their support equipment had departed 4 hours after the ultimatum. A third C-17 carried components of the AN/AQS-20 mine-hunting sonar system. A fourth carried a Navy explosive ordnance disposal team and 60,000 pounds of expendable mine neutralization charges. All 4 aircraft were bound for Bahrain. They would arrive in 11 hours. The equipment would need 6 hours to unpack and integrate. That left 19 hours before the deadline to actually start clearing mines. 300 miles southeast of the strait, the Virginia-class submarine USS Montana was running at 400 feet, making 8 knots on a course that would bring her to the eastern entrance of the strait within 14 hours. Her mission was not mine clearance. Her mission was something much more specific, and her crew did not yet know what it was. The captain had received a fragmentary order coded Pinnacle Lightning. The full tasking would arrive in 4 hours. Until then, they waited. At Bandar Abbas, the largest Iranian naval base on the Gulf, the IRGC Navy was not waiting. They were reinforcing. Commercial satellite imagery captured by Planet Labs at 9:47 local time showed 11 fast attack craft being loaded with what imagery analysts at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency identified as C-802 anti-ship cruise missiles. Each of those missiles carried a 365-pound warhead and had a range of 75 miles. 11 boats, each carrying 2 missiles. 22 missiles that could be launched from small, fast, difficult-to-track platforms dispersed along hundreds of miles of coastline. A single C-802 had crippled the Israeli corvette Hanit in 2006. 22 of them, fired in a coordinated salvo, could overwhelm the defenses of a destroyer. But the fast boats were only one layer. At Jask, 190 miles east of the strait, Iran had positioned its newest coastal defense system, the Khaliji-Fars ballistic anti-ship missile. This was a weapon the Pentagon had been watching for years. A modified Fateh 110 short-range ballistic missile with a terminal guidance seeker designed to hit moving ships. It came down at Mach 3 from the upper atmosphere, giving defenders seconds to react. Each launcher carried 2 missiles. Satellite imagery showed 4 launchers, meaning 8 missiles. The system had never been used in combat. Nobody wanted to find out if it worked the way the Iranians claimed it did. They were about to find out anyway. At 6:30 Wednesday evening, 20 hours into the countdown, the Combined Force Commander at 5th Fleet Headquarters in Bahrain held a video teleconference with CENTCOM in Tampa, the Joint Staff at the Pentagon, and the White House Situation Room. The plan that emerged had 4 phases and 0 margin for error. Phase 1 was suppression. Before a single mine could be cleared, the anti-ship missile threat had to be destroyed. Every known coastal defense site, every mobile launcher hide, every fastboat pen along the Iranian coast from Jask to Bushehr would be hit simultaneously. The Air Force would handle fixed sites with standoff weapons. The Navy would handle mobile targets and pop-up threats. Cyber Command would handle something else entirely. Phase 2 was clearance. The moment air superiority was established over the strait, mine countermeasure assets would begin sweeping a 6-mile-wide safe corridor through the densest minefields. MH-53E helicopters towing Mk-105 magnetic influence sweep sleds would handle the influence mines. Avenger-class ships using hull-mounted sonar would locate contact mines for EOD divers and UUVs to neutralize. The timeline for opening a single safe lane was estimated at 12 to 16 hours after clearance began. Phase 3 was escort. Once the corridor was open, a continuous naval escort operation would guide commercial vessels through the strait under the protective umbrella of Aegis-equipped warships. Phase 4 did not have a name on the briefing slide. It was listed only as contingency. Everyone in the room knew what it meant. If Iran escalated beyond the strait, if missiles started flying at bases or allies, the target list expanded to include Iran's integrated air defense network, its ballistic missile infrastructure, and its command and control nodes. Phase 4 was a regional war. Nobody wanted Phase 4. At 10:15 Wednesday night, 28 hours before the deadline, something changed. An RC-135 Rivet Joint Electronic Surveillance aircraft orbiting at 34,000 feet over the Gulf of Oman detected an unusual communications pattern. Iranian military radio traffic, which had been running at roughly 4 times its normal volume since the crisis began, suddenly dropped. Not gradually, not in stages. It dropped by 80% in under 6 minutes. To a signals intelligence analyst, sudden communications silence means one of two things. Either the network has been destroyed, or the network has switched to a pre-planned wartime mode that relies on landlines, fiber optics and couriers instead of radio. The network had not been destroyed. Iran was going to wartime communications posture, 28 hours before the deadline expired. This mattered. It mattered because wartime comm switching is not something you do to bluff. It takes hours to coordinate. It disrupts normal operations. You only do it when you believe combat is imminent and you want to deny the enemy signals intelligence. The Rivet Joint's crew relayed the detection to the National Security Agency at Fort Meade, which confirmed the assessment within 40 minutes. Iran was not preparing to comply. Iran was preparing to fight. At Fort Meade, the confirmation triggered something that had been staged for 72 hours. United States Cyber Command had been holding access to 14 pre-positioned implants embedded in Iranian military networks. These were not new intrusions. Some of them had been placed years earlier, maintained through patient, invisible persistence, updated quietly during routine Iranian software patches, tested through careful signals that mimicked normal network noise. 12 of the 14 implants were in the Integrated Air Defense Network command layer. One was in the IRGC Navy's shore-based missile coordination system. One was in the electrical grid serving Bandar Abbas Naval Base. None of them had ever been activated. They were insurance policies. Expensive, fragile, and single-use. Once triggered, the Iranians would find them, patch them, and they would be gone forever. Years of access, burned in seconds. The order to activate came at 11:40 Wednesday night. It was signed by the Secretary of Defense and confirmed by the President. Execution was set for 2 o'clock Thursday morning local time, exactly 6 hours before the deadline expired. That timing was deliberate. It would be dark. It would be 6 hours before Iran expected anything to happen. And it would give the first wave of aircraft just enough time to reach their targets before anyone on the ground realized their defenses were compromised. What Tehran didn't know was that the 48-hour ultimatum was never intended to expire. The deadline was theater. Useful theater, necessary theater, because it gave allies time to evacuate non-essential personnel, gave commercial shipping time to clear the area, and gave the diplomatic track just enough oxygen to claim that every alternative had been exhausted. But the operational timeline had never been 48 hours. The operational timeline had been decided the moment the first mine was confirmed in the shipping lane. The only variable was how long it took to move assets into position. By Wednesday night, they were in position. 190 miles to the east, at Jask, the 4 Khaliji Fars launchers were being loaded onto their transport erector vehicles for dispersal. Iranian doctrine called for mobile launchers to relocate every 4 to 6 hours to avoid being caught by satellite surveillance. The launchers had been photographed at their garrison at 2 p.m. By midnight, they would be gone, scattered along 80 miles of coastline, hidden under bridges, in warehouses, in the shadows of apartment buildings. Finding them after dispersal would require persistent drone surveillance and real-time intelligence that might or might not be available. The strike planners at Al-Udeid knew this. The Jask launchers had to die in their garrison before they moved. That meant the timeline just got 6 hours shorter. At 11:50 p.m. Wednesday, a pair of B-2A Spirit stealth bombers passed south of Diego Garcia heading north. They had launched from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri 17 hours earlier, refueled twice over the Atlantic, once over the Indian Ocean, and were now entering their pre-strike holding pattern. Each B-2 carried 16 GBU, 31 Joint Direct Attack munitions in its internal weapons bays, 2,000-pound GPS-guided bombs. 32 of them, total. 16 were assigned to the Jask missile garrison. 16 were assigned to the underground command bunker at Bandar Abbas that served as the IRGC Navy's operational headquarters. The B-2s were not alone. 400 miles to the west, 8 F-35A Lightning IIs from the 421st Fighter Squadron had launched from Al Dhafra Air Base in the UAE at 11:30 p.m. under the cover of what was listed on the air traffic control log as a routine night training sortie. They were not carrying training weapons. Each aircraft carried 2 AGM-154 Joint Standoff weapons and 2 ALM-120D AMRAAM air-to-air missiles. Their targets were the anti-ship missile batteries on Keshem Island and Abu Musa Island, the two positions that most directly threatened mine clearance operations in the strait itself. The F-35s would strike from standoff range, roughly 40 miles from the targets, using their low observable profiles to avoid detection until weapons release. Simultaneously, the